Good morning and welcome to today's meeting of the Children and Families Scrutiny Board. My name is Councillor Alan Lamb and I'm the chair of the board. Just to clarify, this is a remote consultative meeting of the Children and Families Scrutiny Board, and so while it's being webcast live to enable public access, it's not being held as a public meeting in accordance with the Local Government Act 1972. Today's discussion will still very much help inform the work of the board, and should there be any proposed actions stemming from today's meeting that do require formal ratification, these will be referred to the next formal public meeting of the Scrutiny Board for approval. So before we get into the main agenda, I'd like to invite members of the Scrutiny Board, including those who may be in attendance as a substitute member, to introduce themselves, and I'm going to go through in alphabetical order. So if I can start with Kate Blacker, please.
Good morning. Yes, my name's Kate Blacker. I am the Primary Schools Parent Governor representative on the board, member.
Thank you, Kate. And then Tony Britton, please.
Tony Britton, I'm representing the Roman Catholic Diocese of Leeds on the board.
Thank you very much. Councillor Brooks, please.
Good morning, Councillor Kayleigh Brooks, Little London and Woodhouse Ward.
Thank you. And then the bit that confuses everyone, Councillor Flint, please.
Good morning.
Councillor Flint, are you on the call?
She certainly was before.
I did think I'd seen it. Okay, we'll come back to her. So then Councillor Flynn, no T.
Good morning. Yeah, it is confusing. I'm substituting for Ryan Stevenson today.
Thank you. And Celia, please. Celia Foot. No sign of Celia, so we'll come back to her. Councillor Forsyth, please.
Good morning, Councillor Anne Forsyth, Family and Wortley Ward, and my apologies that I'll have to keep the video off for this meeting.
No problem. Thank you, Councillor Forsyth. Andrew Graham, please.
Good morning, Andrew Graham, representing the Church of England Diocese of Leeds.
Thank you. Councillor Gruen, please.
Good morning, Councillor Caroline Gruen. I represent Bramley.
Thank you. Councillor Heselwood, please.
Good morning, Councillor Jules Heselwood, representing Bramley and Stanley Ward, and I believe I'm subbing for Councillor Bithell today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Councillor Hussain, please.
Good morning, Councillor Hussain, representing the Roundhay Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Lay, please.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Sandy Lay, representing Otley and Yeadon Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Marshall Cattung, please.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Abigail Marshall Cattung, representing Little London, Woodhouse and the City Centre.
Thank you. Councillor Renshaw.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Karen Renshaw, representing Housing Robin Hood Ward.
Thank you very much. And then can I give a warm welcome to Councillor Linda Richards, who's a new member of the board. So Councillor Richards, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm very glad to be here and I represent Wetherby Ward.
Very fine part of the city. Councillor Senior, please.
Good morning, I'm Councillor Jane Senior from Morley South Ward.
Thank you very much. Jackie Ward, please.
Good morning, I'm Jacqueline Ward and I represent the Parent Governors for Secondary Schools.
Thank you. And then finally, I'm also very pleased to welcome Laura Whittaker, who is a new co-opted member of the board. So if you'd be happy to introduce yourself, please, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me onto the board. I'm Laura Whittaker. I'm representing Young Lives Leeds and the wider voluntary sector working with children, young people and families across the city.
Thank you very much. Really good to have you with us. And then I understand Celia is now back on the call.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Sorry, I just disappeared for a second somewhere, don't know where. Celia Foot, school staff representative.
We all have those moments, Celia, so but it's good to have you back with us. And then I believe Councillor Flint is now on the call as well.
Yes, snap, I got thrown off too. My name's Emma Flint, Councillor for Wheatwood Ward.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, everybody, and welcome. And then if I can just ask our support officers to introduce themselves as well, starting with Angela, please.
Good morning, I'm Angela Brogden, Principal Scrutiny Advisor.
And then Harriet, please.
Good morning, Harriet Spate, Governance Officer.
Thank you very much. And then we can move straight into the agenda. So item 1, do any members have any declarations of interest? No, I'm not seeing any hands. So item 2 is a meeting note of the 7th of July 2021. A note of the board's consultative meeting on the 7th of July has been provided for information. And while this is not for formal approval, it's still an opportunity for members to raise any matters that they have in relation to that note. So do any members have anything that they wish to raise from that? Nope. So we can move on to the substantive items now. The first item is going to be item 3, the update on thriving, which is the child poverty strategy. Issues surrounding child poverty remains a key area of interest to the board. And so the purpose of this report is to provide board members with an overview of thriving, the child poverty strategy for Leeds, and the work that sits underneath the strategy, including work that's occurred during the pandemic. Appendix 1 of the report gives an update on each of these work streams in terms of recent activities, outcomes, and next steps. So to begin with, I'm going to ask all of the officers and contributors that have joined us to introduce themselves, and then I'll ask Sal and Councillor Venner to introduce the report. So Councillor Venner first, and then we'll work down the list from there.
Oh, good morning, everyone. I'm Councillor Fiona Venner. I'm the Executive Board Member for Children and Adult Social Care, Early Years and Health Partnerships.
Thank you. Councillor Pryor, please.
Morning, everyone. I'm Councillor Pryor. I'm the Executive Member for Economy, Culture and Education.
Thank you. Sal, please.
Morning, everyone. Salim Tariq. I'm Director of Children and Families.
Thank you. Julie, please.
Morning, everybody. I'm Julie Longworth and I'm Deputy Director for Children and Families.
Thank you. And a particularly warm welcome to Shaheen, who is the new Deputy Director for Learning. And feel free to give a bit of a bigger introduction to yourself, Shaheen, but you're very welcome to your first, well, no, it's not your first meeting. You were with us last week, weren't you? But good to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lamb. Good morning, everyone. I'm Deputy Director of Learning, newly appointed and very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Then Ruth Terry, please.
Oh, good morning, everybody. I'm Ruth Terry. I'm Chief Officer for Children's Social Work.
Thank you. Val Waite, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Val Waite. I'm Head of Learning Inclusion.
Thank you. Dave Clark, please.
Morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm Dave Clark. I'm the Head of Learning Improvement.
Thank you. And then finally, Erica, please.
Erica's not with us at the minute, Councillor Lamb. She's joining us for the education paper.
No problem at all. Okay, so if I can hand over to Sal and Councillor Venner initially to give a brief introduction to the report, and then we can get straight into questions and comments from there.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll just make some brief comments because I've talked about this a number of times at Children's Scrutiny, because this is a report that we bring to you 6 monthly. I'll just make some brief comments. So pre-pandemic, there were around 35,000 children in Leeds living in poverty, which was 23% of our child population, which compares to 18% nationally. But Anne Longfield, the previous Children's Commissioner, estimated that an additional 300,000 children will have been pushed into poverty nationally as a direct result of the pandemic. There's also a report going to Exec Board, because we also report to Exec Board 6 monthly. And that has some detail about a specific piece of work that we're doing across adults and children's services about the impact of all the things that are going to hit at once now in the autumn. So obviously a really major one is the £20 uplift on universal credit being removed at the same time as furlough ending, COVID self-isolation payments ending, and fuel costs going up. So that's got the potential to be catastrophic in terms of poverty. The Roundtree Foundation estimate that just the universal credit uplift alone will push an additional 200,000 families into poverty. That's on top of the 300,000 I've just referred to. So There's obviously, as you'll be aware from the news, a lot of campaigning around that and a lot of cross-party campaigning. It's possible that might change, but I think that's doubtful. And then, of course, we've got the additional national insurance that low-paid families will also be paying. So we're really geared up in terms of thriving to deal with this. But this autumn is a particularly challenging time. The report refers to some of the causes of poverty because my ward colleague, Councillor Illingworth, asked at a previous meeting why children were in poverty. So there's some references in the report to things like housing. There's a really big change that's occurred in our city and in cities across the country is that now our largest amount of housing stock is private rented. It would have been social housing, 30 years ago. And I think that's something that's been really magnified during the pandemic. I know that from delivering, food parcels in my own wards, the number of families living in very low quality, private rented housing. And then there's also some references in causes to the benefit system. So the Thriving strategy has 7 work streams. And for each work stream, you've got some quantitative information, like how many packs of period products we've given out, how many meals we've given out, and you've also got qualitative feedback and case studies. There's a new work stream which we've introduced post-COVID because we had a look in the Thriving board at the pandemic, and in the light of that, whether there were any things we would change. And green space, I think, has emerged over the pandemic as a real inequality in terms of families living in poverty. So you may remember some really unfortunately negative publicity that children and young people in Hare Hills attracted during the first lockdown when they were playing out on the streets, and our youth service and police worked together on that. But it was really, really understandable why, in terms of, families living in incredibly densely populated areas in small housing, overcrowded, no gardens. There are 7 high rises in my own ward, all of which have children living in them. And I think families definitely had an easier time during lockdown if they had a garden, if they could really easily walk to a park when we were allowed out once a day. So lack of access to green space was really highlighted as an issue we hadn't looked at and hadn't had that focus on before. So that's a new work stream, which is why we haven't got loads of detail in the report, but we're working, the whole of Thrive is very cross council and cross city, but we'll be bringing, there's 2 people from Planning and Parks and Countryside that are coming on to the Thriving board just to work on the green space issue. We've also focused a lot more on working in a cross-directorate way around care leavers, and that's partly through Thriving and partly through the corporate parenting board that I also chair, where we've got really brilliant sort of cross-directorate work between housing and children's around our care leavers and who often are in housing need, and the fact they are our children, and what that means, and what it means for the housing department to be a corporate parent in terms of making sure care leavers are appropriately housed. One of the areas that we need to focus on now is the voice of children and young people, in that when we set up Thriving, which was 3 years ago, children were really involved. Up to the pandemic, actually, children were really involved. So we had a Child Friendly Leeds Ambassador event on child poverty that was held at Catch in Hare Hills that was hosted by children. They did loads of the presentations. And that's kind of dropped off a bit during the pandemic. So we need to look at how we directly have children and young people involved in the work of the board, but in a way that's interesting and engaging in terms of long meetings aren't always that attractive to children and young people, and they're totally zoomed out. So our voice and influence team have struggled a bit with things like our Care Leavers Council and have a voice council in terms of getting children and young people to engage in Zoom when they're having to do it all the time for studying. So that's a priority for the next few months, is how we re-engage children really directly in the work. And my final comment is one that I make every time, which is that as a politician, it's sort of quite frustrating really that we don't, as a local council, control the levers to lift people out of poverty. That rests with national government, but we do have a responsibility to ameliorate the impact of poverty, and that's what that's why Thrive exists. And also there's a really strong moral imperative to the work. So even if we can't demonstrate outcomes, even if we can't demonstrate that healthy holidays and feeding children in school holidays means they get better exam results, we will still do it because it's morally wrong that children are hungry. So there's a really strong moral imperative to the work, as well as having a solid evidence base where we can demonstrate both outputs and outcomes. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Venner. Sal, is there anything you wanted to add at this point?
Not a lot, Councillor Lamb. I think Councillor Venner has given quite a comprehensive introduction. I mean, what I would set out how we are feeling the impact of poverty in the city and the impact that COVID additionally brings to that. We've seen through the pandemic how it has been highlighted and how they impact particularly on those that live in parts of the city that are most deprived, and also that then has a knock-on impact in terms of demand for services, not just in children's services, but right across the council. And I think our plan with this strategic work is to bring a broader range of people together to try and mitigate some of those patterns. So the work to include readiness for learning.
Sal, apologies, we're just struggling a bit with your connection. You sound a bit like you're underwater. So I'm happy to persevere from it, but I don't know if it's worth you logging out or back in or anything like that.
Okay, I'm happy to log out and come back in.
That's better, actually. No, that's better.
Okay.
Problem solved.
Okay. Let me know if it goes again. Thank you. So the work that we're working on are readiness for learning and school age education, housing and provision that Councillor Ben has mentioned.
On again.
Sorry, Sal, it's gone. It's gone again. There's a sweet spot if you don't move where it sounds great, but
I'll log out and come back in.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean we've had a really good introduction from Councillor Venner. I don't know if any of the other officers, Councillor Prowse, anything you wanted to chip in? Yep, go ahead.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think Councillor Venner is completely right in saying that while we don't have some of the levers to lift people out of poverty, it is our role to alleviate some of the effects of that poverty. And I just wanted to highlight one statistic in the report when we're looking specifically at free school meals across Leeds. Back in March 2020, before the lockdown, we had almost 26,000 children on free school meals across the city. Today, that's increased by around 30% to about 33,000 children on free school meals. So I think that just demonstrates, not just did we have this work on child poverty to do before the pandemic, actually the volume of work and the significance of that poverty and how much that's increased over the past 18 months. And I think that just puts into context the scale of this task. And I think that's just important to note.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, so we can move into questions and comments now. So who would like to kick off with the questions, please? I'm not seeing any hands leaping up so far, which is extremely unusual for this board. Anybody have a question? Councillor Forsyth, please. So you're still muted, Councillor Forsyth.
Yes, not exactly a question, really. I'm really pleased to see the inclusion of that new section about the use of green space. I notice that part of the report is necessarily quite short at the moment. There's major opportunities there in using the green space. And one thing that's not mentioned is the possible opportunity for use of our HRA land has actually started to possibly grow food and to engage people in actually working some of the land as well. That's, yes, okay. So that was the only part I wanted to sort of highlight. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Forsyth. The hands are leaping up now. But just on that point, it would be useful to understand what work is going on with the planning department. I know I sit on development plans panel, and myself and Councillor Grewin and others have been pressing hard to make sure there's much more engagement with children and young people as part of the planning process. And we're pleased to hear that children and young people have been quite heavily engaged in the local plan update 1 around climate change, and there's very positive feedback from officers, but it has felt a battle at times to try and persuade them of the value of engaging with children and young people and children's services. So it'd be useful just to hear specifically what's happening about that and how we're looking to make progress. And then, so if someone wants to pick that up, and then I've got quite a few hands to go to after that.
I'm happy to jump in there, Councillor Lamb. Just to say that actually we've had a lot of support from our corporate colleagues. I think on the back of the pandemic, the lockdown, the impact that we have seen on children and families who haven't had access to open space, to green space, I think has really, really brought the issue to the fore like never before. So actually we've got a lot of support going on across corporately, also with third sector colleagues, local community groups. So I think really we're pushing against an open door, if you like. I think there's a real momentum and commitment. I think has been referenced in the report. It's early days in terms of the work stream, but we've got dates, we've got meetings in place now. So I think it will be about us agreeing some really clear priorities and objectives for that work stream, and to really see some tangible action as we go forward. I think the other thing that you've referenced there is actually voice and influence, and the views of children and families being absolutely central to that. So I think we're really looking forward to reporting in more detail about the plans and the objectives from the work stream.
Okay, thank you for that, Julie. And I can assure you that there are some loud voices sat around the development plans panel table who are banging the drum on this. So next I've got Kate, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about, it was actually something that I'd read in the national press, just thinking about what you were saying, Fiona, in relation to poverty and housing in particular. And I was just concerned by an article that I was reading about the impact particularly of inappropriate housing on children with disabilities, so children and families with disabilities really, and just thinking it's quite striking what you and Jonathan have said about obviously the significant sort of increase in poverty as a result of the pandemic, and how that's impacting on families, and the changes in terms of availability of social housing versus private housing. And I was just quite concerned to read this article about the impact particularly on children with disabilities, and to what extent there'll be any sort of focused work on their needs, and particularly in the context of obviously what you've talked about.
Okay, who'd like to respond to that, please?
I can start and then see if anyone else wants to come in. I mean, one thing the report makes clear is the intersectionality around poverty. So if you're disabled or you've got a disabled family member, including a disabled child, you're much more likely to be living in poverty. So most families with disabled children are actually living in poverty. And yeah, housing's a really major issue. So I mean, as a council, in terms of social housing, we do undertake adaptations for families where they've got children with disabilities in private houses as well as in our own housing stock. But there is no doubt that the pandemic has particularly affected families who've got children with disabilities. I've had quite a lot of direct contact from families, particularly in the first lockdown, in terms of the isolation that people were experiencing. Within housing, we do have another work stream which is around selective licensing. I'm not sure if it's, I can't remember if it's referred to in this report. So we have a selective licensing scheme in Hare Hills and in Beeston in South Leeds. So that's two of our highest deprivation areas with really high numbers of children. I mean, the pandemic really impacted on this in that officers weren't able to go in and do house visits, but this is about raising standards in the private sector. It's about landlords having to have particular licenses, and part of it is a rigorous programme of inspections where people will be going into private rented housing, and that's a really important piece of joint work between housing and children's. It's not only about poverty, it's also about the fact that when housing staff go into people's homes, they can sometimes pick up safeguarding issues or other concerns around families where there may be issues that we're not aware of because the families aren't in contact with children's social work or early help. So that's a really important piece of joint work. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Fiona. So next is Andrew Graham, please.
Thank you. My question is just around the provision for healthy holidays. Obviously, the holiday time can be a very vulnerable time for children in poverty. And I welcome the provision that's gone on for healthy holidays, and provision of food seems to be particularly successful. I'm just keen to know how we ensure that there's a fair kind of geographical distribution of face-to-face activities for children across the city.
Okay, thank you for that. Who's going to pick that? Councillor Venner, is that you again? No?
Yeah, I'm really happy to pick it up. I was wondering if this sits under me and Councillor Price, so Councillor Price might want to come in as well. It is a limited pot of funding, which means we haven't been able to distribute it to every area of the city in every holiday. It has been targeted at the areas of highest deprivation, which is obviously the right thing to do when you've got a limited amount of money. But what we have encouraged areas to do is to work in consortiums and to work in partnership with other areas so that outer areas can have access to the schemes as well. And it's been delivered through schools and community hubs and third sector organisations. It is really successful. Kirkstall Valley Development just deliver it in my ward. And I spoke to the manager yesterday who said over the summer they've had something like, I think it was 426 families, which is just fantastic. And it's really well targeted. So it is targeting children that access free school meals. I think the reality is, with the funding we've had access to, that we've had ourselves and the Leeds Community Foundation have administered, the reality is it doesn't reach every child on free school meals. It's not enough to do that, so we do have to target it, which means, I mean, there's loads of metrics that inform the areas it goes to. It's looking at free school meals, looked after children, SEND, deprivation in areas. So it's really well considered where the funding goes. But the reality is we reach as many children as we possibly can who are entitled to free school meals, but we can't reach every single one. We've also done some things like given schools themselves access to resources. So for example, when we've given schools hampers to give out, we've given them 10% more than they've got children on free school meals, so they can make some judgments about the families that are just below the free school meal threshold but may still be struggling. So we've worked with schools as well to access as many children and families as we can.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Lay is next, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm trying to understand the Leeds. Page 15 talks about the measures of child poverty. The government has two measures, one that is 60% of the UK average at 17,760 and absolute poverty at 13,166. But then it says, and I agree with this, poverty cannot be measured in terms of just in terms of household income. But we must therefore, to be able to set a line somewhere, have a pound sign somewhere that says what is our Leeds definition of poverty, or do we just look at people's circumstances rather than a financial number like the government uses? The second, so I'd like to better understand the Leeds definition, other than, because it goes on to talk about causes of child poverty straight underneath, but it doesn't say that that's the definition. So I just want to understand the Leeds definition a bit better. And secondly, we compare ourselves to national figures and regional figures. How do we compare to other core cities? Because yesterday in council, we had a white paper where we compared apples with pears on Ofsted. So it would be nice to know how we compare with core cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Light. Who can pick that one up, please? Without straying back into yesterday's debates would be helpful. Thank you.
I'm happy to come in.
Thank you, Julie.
I think in terms of, I suppose, the Leeds approach to, identifying children, families that are living in poverty, obviously we have those national definitions. I think in Leeds, really, I think it is about the impact on the children, in the family. And I think, that's, for me, it is about back to our values, our principles, about having the right conversation at the right time with individual children and families. So I think, in that sense, the door is not closed. I think it is about us working together as a system within children and families, but with our partners to identify the impact of poverty on children and families. And I think that's about it being very needs-led. I mean, obviously, in terms of some of the funding that comes into the city, there is national criteria around that. So we have no leeway in terms of that, in terms of how we use it. But in terms of the Leeds approach, it is the approach of being a compassionate city, a compassionate directorate, and a compassionate partnership. And that's about looking at every child and every family, in their own individual rights.
Okay, thank you for that, Julie. Can I bring in Councillor Renshaw next, please?
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask if there are any ways of projecting, now that universal credit's going to be cut, along with many other things, and more adults will be going back to the furloughed scheme of work, which may bring more poverty actually into families of young people. And I just wondered if there was any projected figures and how we're going to tackle that in the increase in poverty, which will impact on the mental health and well-being of young people. So I just wondered if there were any plans in place for the mental health and well-being of young people, which were already struggling due to the lack of funding, obviously through our budget that's shrinking every year, year on year. So what can we do as a council in order to help those young people?
Yeah, sorry, Chair, is it okay for me to come back on that? So some of that projections happen nationally, some of it's happening locally. So for example, I referred to the Roundtree Foundation have estimated 200,000 families will fall into poverty because of the £20 uplift being removed. We know in Leeds there are 50,000 people on furlough. I think that's right. Jonathan will correct me if it's not. So we have got some, this is the piece of work that we've been doing so that we can plan for the impact in the autumn of all these things happening at once, like furlough ending, £20 uplift ending, etc. Councillor Renshaw, I raised this this started as a project within Children's because of Thrive, but I also sit on the Mental Health Partnership Board and I chair Future in Mind, which is the Children's Mental Health Strategy Board. And I raised this at the Mental Health Partnership Board because we know from the suicide audits we've done in the city that increasingly in each subsequent audit, and they're always covering 3 years, worklessness, finance and debt has been an increasingly presenting issue. So we know it has potentially devastating consequences for adults and children. So it felt important that that work actually became adults and children. So the work around how we're going to deal with the impact of the autumn is happening across adults and children's. And I think Future in Mind are going to present the next scrutiny board or the one after that. So we know that the two really, really big impacts of the pandemic that are falling particularly hard on children are the mental health impact and the economic impact, and that obviously they also overlap, intersect, affect each other. So there's a huge amount of work happening around children's mental health in the city, which is very much in the context of COVID, in the context of child poverty. Child poverty is a theme throughout Future in Mind because we know that impacts children's mental health. I don't know if that answers your question enough.
I'll just ask maybe Jonathan as well, Councillor Pryor. Are the schools doing any work to prepare themselves for this, especially, well, all the schools throughout the city, to prepare themselves to help deal and tackle the mental health issues that will be sort of on board with families that they probably didn't expect it with, or to support those families that were already on the poverty line, but not quite classed as living in poverty?
Yeah, I'm from conversations I've had with schools, a lot of schools will be running kind of their own programs. I know some academy chains do as well as kind of the more citywide things. This kind of does stray slightly from this scrutiny board when we're talking about kind of furlough and the end of furlough, but obviously employment is part of my remit as well. And we are I just want to reassure the board that we're also doing quite a hefty bit of work to kind of shift around some of our employment practices. Kind of before the pandemic, a lot of our work was geared at those kind of furthest from employment, those who'd maybe been on long-term sick, or, you know, kind of what we needed to do to get them back into the world of work. With furlough ending, we may be in a situation where we've got a large proportion of highly employable people who suddenly find themselves unemployed. So we're doing work with businesses across the city, just seeing what we can do to basically turn people around and get them straight back out into work. So yes, absolutely, that work is being done on kind of what's going to happen if there are those mental health impacts from increased unemployment, but at the same time, we're also working to try and ensure that hit from unemployment is as small as possible in our city.
Thank you. I just think,
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I just was going to add, maybe we should keep a monitor like we did once previously on the young people not in education, employment or training, and see what impact
that does come to us.
Element.
That does come to us on a regular basis, Councillor Renshaw, anyway, so we can certainly keep an eye on that. And I just want to ask Councillor Pratt if we know, just to help with the indications of the, I mean, if we take account of roughly 50,000 people on furlough, is there a figure of how many of them have been doing other employment while they've been on furlough, which would help to give us a clue as to how many are going to be in a difficult situation afterwards?
I can certainly try and find those figures and bring them to you, but yeah, I didn't prepare those for this morning, but yeah.
That's fair enough. That'd just be useful, because I think a lot of people forget that you can still do other work if you're on furlough, and many people will just seamlessly, they'll be doing quite nicely in some cases, because they'll be getting 80% of their previous wage and 100% of the wage of their other work, and they'll see a drop off, but it'd just be useful to know and help us to understand what that impact is going to be when furlough unwinds.
Sure, I'm more than happy to kind of just pull together a short report that I'll circulate to the scrutiny board with any relevant information on how furlough and employment will link to children and young people.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. Dave, did you want to chip in on this?
Yeah, I'm just going to, thanks, Councillor Lamb. I was just going to pick up on Councillor Renshaw's point about whether schools were prepared for the mental health and well-being of their young people. And from our discussions with schools particularly over the last 6 months, there's a significant amount of preparation and planning from schools that they've been putting that in their development plans of how they're going to support those young people that have had a significant impact on their well-being, their mental health, as well as their education. And lots of the schools are linked in with support that's coming from teams that work with Val in terms of all the mental health development for their staff to support the young people. So I think that schools have done a significant amount of work and are very prepared for those issues.
Thank you for that. I see Val and Julie have both got your hands up to come in. Julie was fastest to unmute, so I'll bring you in first. In fact, there are quite a few members waiting, so I just encourage you both to be as brief as you can, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Lamb. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, as Councillor Bennett said, I think it's referenced in the report about the group that we've pulled together from children's services, adult services and key partners, really to take a proactive approach to, I suppose, combating, mitigating the impact of the reduced income for children and families. Within that, we're doing a lot of work with children's centres, early help hubs, the targeted services leads in the clusters to really reach out in terms of awareness raising with children and families, that these changes are going to take place, but also signposting children and families in terms of benefits advice, other sources of advice and support. So I'll leave it there, but thank you, Councillor Lamb.
Thanks, Julie. And Val, did you want to add something at this point?
Just very, very quickly, Councillor Lamb, just to reassure members really that an awful lot of resources have gone into schools and are accessible to schools, and that the educational psychology team are currently making visits to every single school across the authority, one, to find out how things are going right at the beginning of term, and to identify any specific needs in young people or any specific needs in terms of additional resources, and support them for the training that's already been delivered of how they, in the schools themselves, then can relay that training into practice within each of the schools. So there's lots going on at the moment. Thank you, Councillor Lamb.
Okay, thank you for that. So I appreciate everybody's patience. There's still a few people with hands up. I'm just going through in the order that they went up, so I will get to you. So Councillor Brooks is next, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm going to sort of go back to planning. Sorry, it's one of my things. Because I'm an inner city representative. I have to say, like, 70 to 80% of my casework is housing related. So my motivation comes from this lived experience of my constituents. But I am encouraged that the department is going to be liaising more closely with planning. But in terms of like affordables and action on affordables, I'd just like to know, because obviously housing costs are one of the highest costs and one of the main causes of poverty, according to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So I'd just like to know how much information is shared with the planning department from Child Friendly Leeds and the data that's gathered, because I really do think that there needs to be a bigger emphasis on delivering affordables, not just social housing, but also affordable housing within the planning system. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Brooks. And if I can just add something to that, usually the engagement with the planning department tends to be around education on specific applications. And I think there's something for corporately the children's department to think about, perhaps paying more attention to applications that are coming in and submitting comments about how they will impact children and young people. There should be an assessment done, but it tends to be a bit tokenistic in my experience. Councillor Caroline Grew might want to comment as well as chair of a planning committee, but I feel that there could be a much stronger relationship. And actually living in the exact opposite to Councillor Brooks, I represent a ward which is very green, although it's not anywhere near as much as you might think is accessible, but there are lots of places to walk, to play. Most people live close or close enough to walk to some green space, lots of nice places to walk and exercise. And you really see the benefit to children and young people of that. And I'm as passionate as Councillor Brooks is about trying to, and Councillor Illingworth, if he was here, would be making these points as well. But having that access to green space in inner city areas is really something that should be given a much, much bigger priority.
But also access to affordable housing as well, Councillor Lamb. That's what my point was.
Yes. So who'd like to pick those? Councillor Venner?
I'll make a couple of comments, but I do think it would be good to go to Councillor Gruen after me, if that's, I know, slightly out of sequence, but I think the point's probably on this in this area. I used to chair development plans panel at the height of the kind of site allocations plan process, and actually, I have to say, I would have really welcomed the input of children. It would have been a lot easier to communicate with than some of the people I needed to liaise with at that time. Actually, when Chair, when you did the scrutiny inquiry about is Leeds a child-friendly city, I know that planning came out as one of the areas where there does need to be increased liaison between children's and planning, and I think we would all welcome that. Just to give you a practical example of where that has happened, and this was instigated by Councillor Gruen. It used to be the case that when a private sector organisation set up a children's home anywhere in the city, they'd apply for planning permission to do that, but it wouldn't come to the children's services. It wouldn't come to children's services. It would just be purely a planning process. And Councillor Gruen picked up on this because there are a couple of applications in her ward, and we do now have a process where if somebody's applying for planning permission for a children's home, they have to come to us for comments, because there are things we would pick up as a department that planning might not pick up about what is actually suitable housing for a child, including things like access to outdoor space. So that's an example where communication is better than it was between planning and children's. But in terms of affordable homes, I think we would all agree that that's necessary, but we are working within really frustrating national planning legislation, and I think we all know that affordable housing doesn't mean affordable. It means a percentage of the cost of the other houses in the scheme. So yes, and again, I think this is an area where it feels like we don't have the levers to change this nationally. We're dealing with the impact of poor quality housing and the impact of not having enough housing stock. You know, like Councillor Brooks, I've got an inner city ward, so it's predominantly housing casework, and not enough housing stock, not enough affordable housing is the main issue. But it's an issue within national legislation. There's a really limited amount to what we can do to change that locally. We're much more ending up dealing with ameliorating the impact. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I'm going to break my usual habit and bring Councillor Gruen in, because I know it will be on this subject.
Yes, it is on this subject, Chair, because you invited me to comment, so I thought I would give my zenith on this one. Yes, I mean, I know that you are passionate, and many members of the Development Plan panel are passionate about this issue about making places to live, and that includes places for children to live happily and comfortably. And I would just point to some strategic things, some of which are actually out of the council's control, but all of which the council could work towards. I think the first one is cross-council working, and Councillor Ben has just given an example of where there was no cross-council working between children's services and planning services, and now there is a small amount, but it does need to be increased. And I think all council services need to be much more prepared, perhaps, than they have been in the past, to look across at different departments. And it is true, Councillor Benner, that, for example, in the building of schools, there is discussion between planning and children's services, but not particularly about the suitability of the school for education, more about where it is and its dimensions and form and so on. So there's lots of room for improvement there. As you mentioned, Chair, I think that the involvement of young people's views in the planning arena has long been sought, and although we're beginning to chip away at that one, we absolutely are not there. And one of the issues I have around the planning service is that it's a very, in my view, it's a very difficult and technical language which is used in constructing the reports, and indeed in the discussion around the table. And you couldn't expect children and young people to be able to cope with and understand that language. It took me about a year before I could really understand the construction of those reports. And I think it really is down to us to present young people with something that they can really understand and make sense of. And they would make a massive contribution, for example, towards what we consider to be good play areas for children. I'm sure that they would be able to ensure that we do a lot better than we do actually in that arena. So I do think children are a priority. The other big, I won't call it a barrier, the big challenge that we have in this area has got to be the developers. And I think it's down to us to develop better partnerships with developers. But developers will only do what results in a profit for them. So it can be really hard work getting developers to give sufficient attention to placemaking that is suitable for families and families in all income groups. I'll leave it there because, you know, you can tell I can go on all morning, but I won't.
Yeah, no, it's really helpful, Councillor Gruen. I think there's a lot in it, and linking it back, which was Councillor Brooks's point for raising this, is the impact that this has on poverty and child poverty makes it a prize worth pursuing. And things like perhaps trying to engage corporately with the developers at a high level to get them on board with the child-friendly ambitions and get them to understand actually what a big impact they can have in what they do. It is one of the real key drivers. So it's perhaps something we might even want to look at doing a bit more work on as a board. We've done a piece of work previously, but it could have a huge impact if we could address it. So I don't know, did anyone else want to comment? Sal or Councillor Venner, did you want to come back on any of that? Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things, can you hear me now? Is this working
yes,
better?
yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, much better.
Thank you.
Don't move.
Yeah, I mean, I really do take on board the points that have been made in relation to this, and you know, that's why we've got the one of the priorities through Thriving to be the green spaces work stream. So hopefully we'll start to get some feedback back in our regular updates through Thriving about the work that's going on there. But I also take the points that have been raised around our engagement with planning. When major programmes do come through from different parts of the council, they do come through the corporate leadership team at which we are present, and it is my role there to champion children within that process. And so you know, I do raise that issue in terms of whether those plans and programmes fully consider the needs of children. So there's a kind of championing role that I undertake there, but I also accept that some more dedicated and formal liaison with planning department can take place, and I'll pick that up.
Thank you, Sal. Okay, so I really do appreciate everybody's patience so far. Councillor Flint was next on the list, please.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think this report is brilliant, and I'm really proud that we're prioritising child poverty across all departments. And I really welcome the addition of looking at access to green space. I guess I was, from my experience of youth work, thinking about how poverty needs to have a fully rounded picture of child poverty. We need to really emphasize like poverty of opportunity as well, and as well, in addition to the stream for green space, maybe we need to prioritize more access to creativity and the arts, because I think children, and I guess highlighted by the pandemic, it's such a vital part of kind of having an outlet and improving mental health, having access to the arts. And I think when we look at children in poverty, there's a real lack of opportunity. So I think we really need to prioritise as a council, looking at that, and from my sociology days, looking at kind of the inverse care law, even though we put things out to be available, like who is actually accessing these? Is it the children that actually need it? So I think when we talk about kind of programs for helping children living in poverty with their mental health, a lot of the time children don't want to sit around and talk about their mental health. They want to do something, and that might be sport, but it might be reading, it might be theatre, it might be dancing, and we just need to really look at equal access and opportunity, to arts and culture, as well as the green space.
Okay, thank you for that, Councillor Flint. Anyone want to pick up on those points, Dave?
Yeah, just briefly, in terms of I think there's a real hope and desire, Councillor Flint, that the work around the Year of Culture will feed very much into that agenda that you're talking about there. I know that there's a lot going around council-wide in terms of the development of the arts, and we've just from a school point of view, we've already had those very early conversations with head teachers about how we can engage schools and settings with the Year of Culture to promote the culture and the arts.
Okay, thank you for that, Dave. Councillor Richards is next, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I was kind of focusing on the employment and transition section because that is an area that I do get involved with. I'm aware that traditionally children from these poverty backgrounds, there are poor outcomes in terms of progression, and I'm wondering if anybody can give me, if there are any stats which show how the COVID has impacted. It was really good to see the responses to this, to talk about the work which is already going on, and we talk about the arts, all these things which are already happening. But I'm interested to see whether schools are being directly engaged to actually positively focus on these particularly vulnerable groups of children. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Who can respond to that, please?
Can respond to that actually, if that's any help.
Yeah, go ahead, Erica, and thank you for joining us. Do you want to introduce yourself? You've just joined us, I think. So.
Yeah, I'm Erica Hines. I'm the 0 to 19 lead. We are actually doing a lot of work to try and promote positive destinations for all pupils, and particularly for the more disadvantaged. But to get what we're actually currently doing is asking all schools to contact the 15 to 20% of last year's Year 11 cohort, prioritising the most vulnerable and also those who intended to do an apprenticeship, and confirm that they've reached their destination. And if they haven't, we're asking careers advisors to work with the young people in the first instance to secure a positive destination. And if further support's required, to contact the Leeds Pathways team, so that we're getting we're responding much more quickly than usual to young people who are potentially NEET than we have done in the past.
Thank you, Erica. So it's Councillor Flynn next, please. Thank you for your patience.
Thanks, Alan. Emma and I are getting thoroughly confused with our names being so similar. I think this one's for Sal. We had this conversation, Sal, about 18 months or so ago. One of the keys to escaping poverty, obviously, is education. And I think we agree that the earlier we start, the better. But it's always simplistic. I think you said when we last spoke about this to sort of correlate, an earlier start with outcomes at a later life, but it certainly can't do any harm. I was just looking at the early years and the take up of free nursery places on pages 39 and 40, and I don't think it's any surprise to see that the three areas which are suffering most from low take up are Beeston, Hare Hills, and Bermontoffs. And I think we talked in terms of the specific difficulties that surround us, those three areas. It doesn't seem to have moved much since we last spoke, Sal, but of course COVID has intervened. And I just wondered, I know what your targets are, no problem at all with those, but getting those 2-year-olds or the 2-year-old cohort up to the 90% from where they are now, particularly in the likes of Hare Hills, looks a massive task.
Okay, Sal, I think that's for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've identified, the key issue in terms of the impact of COVID there, in terms of us being able to do much about this. We did, when we had this conversation before, talk about a series of measures that we had in place that were aimed at really targeting those children and young people to engage in taking up their 2-year-old places. And we've taken a series of measures by looking at places where this was better than in Leeds, and so we'd looked at plans that Newcastle had implemented, and there were some relatively straightforward, low cost, no cost type of approaches that we could take, and we wanted to implement those. But obviously, we've had to respond to how matters have progressed in terms of COVID. We've been providing services around our own early years services have been providing during the pandemic. I've had to provide services from hubs rather than from every single children's centre being open. Private providers have been hit significantly through the pandemic, but what we've tried to do is to we are now obviously getting back up to speed in terms of children using our own children's centres, but through the pandemic we spent a lot of time supporting particularly the private sector in terms of early years and childcare, and we've developed stronger relationships with the sector, I think, in that period of time. So I would say that we've got the potential now, if we're getting back to some sense of normality, to try and build on the plans that we had previously. We've also engaged with an organisation called Nesta, who are going to help us with an analysis around analysis of how we collect the data, and an analysis of the data to help us with driving forward plans to really improve this, because I think there's plenty of evidence around, as you say, that actually impacting very early on children and young people makes a massive difference in terms of their outcomes as adults. I know others might want to pick up on bits more of that detail. Julie, I think, is wanting to come in.
Okay, Julie, if you could come in quick, we've got a couple more contributors, and I'm just conscious of time. We've still got a couple of big items to get through, so if you want to go ahead, yeah.
Very much so. So just building on what Sal said, we've just entered into a really, really exciting 3, possibly 5-year partnership with Nesta, and the whole focus is on reimagining our early years services across the city. We've had a discovery phase, and in that discovery phase, we've identified the key priorities, one of which is around take up of the 2-year-old offer. We're doing a lot of work in terms of, why is it that, as an example, some children's centres are doing better than others when actually the demographies and the areas are similar. So there's an awful lot of work going on, and we look forward to perhaps updating the board at future meetings, because I think there will definitely be some really great outcomes as a result.
Okay, thank you for that, Julie. So I'm going to take Celia and then Jackie, and then the responses to those points, and then just if there's any final points from Councillor Venner, Pryor or Sal before we just sum up and then move on. So Celia, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Councillor Flint, because you set that up very well. My question is about children's centres. I am aware of the Nesta work going on. I attend the Learning for Life update meetings for unions, and it sounds very interesting. My question about the children's centres is I'm really aware of that the COVID had a big impact on their ability to remain open. There were partial closures and full closures, and I'm also aware that staffing recruitment issues are still a problem. So that again, and Councillor Flynn asked about how do we get more take up in areas of need, but also how do we support, because coming this autumn and winter, it's likely we're going to have some of the same issues with COVID. How can we support the children's centres, both the local authority ones and the private ones, to remain open and allow parents to actually carry on working in many cases?
Okay, thank you for that, Celia. And Jackie, did you want to make your point as well? And then we can do the responses and then wrap up on this section.
Yeah, mine is a different one completely. I'm looking at the young people status who is not known. It's like the NEET figures, like between the NEET and the not known, we're going over 1,000 children. My question is are the figures that high for the not known because the sixth form providers or the apprenticeships people haven't come back yet to us to say where they've gone? Or are they just not known and nobody knows where they are? Because I thought over the years, in the last 10 years I've been on the board, we've been quite good at knowing where people have gone. And I know with apprenticeships over the COVID, a lot of apprenticeships didn't happen because I know people would, the vacancies weren't there, or else because of COVID couldn't start. So I was thinking, are they starting now or what's happening? Just that's my thing.
Okay, so who wants to respond? Julie, I think you were going to come in on the children's centres bits, and then Councillor Pryor.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Lamb. It's absolutely right to say that our own children's centres have had, significant challenge during the pandemic. As a result of infections, staff having to self-isolate, just the national guidance around that. As has been said, it's not just Little Owls, our own children's, and it's right across the piece in terms of all of the early years daycare providers in Leeds. We have regular bronze meetings with all of those providers. And that does provide a forum really to, I suppose, share the challenges, problem solve, try to take a coordinated approach where we can to particular problems. Some of the things that we're doing within our Little Owls centres is we have increased the number of apprenticeships across the piece as a response to this particular challenge. So we've now got an increased take-in of apprenticeships. So that will really enable us to grow our own, because we've got to have our eye on the future as well, because I don't think that this is an issue that's going to go away in terms of our ability to recruit into the sector. One of the other things that we have done is we're forming a relationship with Migration Yorkshire. So again, looking at individuals who perhaps have been newly arrived into the city, as an example, who may well have a wealth of experience, whether that's professional or whether that's through bringing up their own children and their own families. So we have a real strategy around this. It's trying to think a little bit outside of the box and a little bit more creatively, but I have to say it has been a challenge, and it does continue to be a challenge. Thank you, Councillor Lamb.
Okay, thank you for that. And Val, sorry, it's Councillor Pryor was going to come in, and then I'll bring Val in.
Yeah, it's just on that the last point about apprenticeships. So I think it's certainly fair to say that a lot of employers may have taken fewer on. We did, as a council, make a guarantee, and the guarantee still stands, that anyone who has an apprenticeship disrupted by COVID, say they were partway through, the council will intervene to ensure that they can finish that apprenticeship. So that's either by matching them up with a new employer, or kind of finding the funding for their current one to finish that qualification. I just think that's important to reiterate that offer is still out there to any young person in the city.
Okay, thank you. And then Val, please.
Just very quickly in response to Jackie's question, that was around those overall figures of children that are missing from education. Yes, particularly those that are at the level where they're school leavers, leaving schools and into colleges and going into other local authorities, neighbouring authorities. We do sometimes have issues that are around actually the data collection, where young people have joined the role of a college. It's outside of Leeds, it's in a neighbouring authority, and they collect their data at different times to the way that we can then present it. So we are working very closely with those individual institutions, and this year we're seeing a far better return, so that we're knowing where young people are. Some of it, the work that is being done at the moment around need, is very much that we often have destinations for young people when they're leaving school. Some of the issues that they maintain that placement, over the following year after they've left school. So again, we've got a whole programme of work that's addressing that. In terms generally of children missing education, we have got a whole, again, priority that is looking at those children that are missing education and what the reasons, the rationales are for that, and whether it's safeguarding, knocking on doors, which we do on a regular basis, of children that have not attended school, have not returned to school in September. There's a whole programme of safeguarding where we go, we knock on the doors, we identify where those young people are, but we also have children that are moving new into the local authority, and it's those children as well that are classed as missing education because they've not got a current placement as yet. And again, that's what we're working with our attendance team with, and also our admissions team with.
Okay, thank you for that. There's a quick question from Councillor Flynn in the chat. If so, who's best placed to respond to that one, please?
Jump in, Councillor Lamb. I was just typing into the chat. Just to say that this is an example of the very issue that we are looking at in more detail through the Nesta programme. So there's something about unpicking our data, diving into the data. But as an example, we've just had a focus group with parents from Hare Hills, from that area, just to engaging with them, to find out from them, why is it, what are the reasons, what are the barriers. There's already some initial learning around that in terms of the sorts of activities, issues around English not being first language, issues around speech and language. So we're really getting into the detail to understand the barriers so that we can come up with the solutions to have an improved picture.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, thank you for that, Julie. So I think that's been a really useful and interesting session. Just for members' information, this is an item that comes to us every 6 months, so it's due again in March. We've got a commitment from Councillor Pryor to come back with a little bit of information around furlough and some statistics around that. I would suggest if you're agreeable and Sal and Councillor Venner are agreeable, and you please feel free to respond when you sum up in a second, that perhaps might be appropriate for me on behalf of the board to write to the Chief Planning Officer to raise some of the issues we've discussed today and invite him to come to that session, which I think will be in March when we're discussing this again, to see what to sort of look for sort of a joint action plan between Sal and Mr. Feeney to see how those issues can be picked up and how we can get better engagement between children and families and the planning department. And that would give 6 months to sort of look and start thinking about that and have some conversations. And I can show you Councillor Gruen and myself and Councillor Brooks and others will be banging away at development plans panel and various plans panels on that issue as well. But obviously there's a lot of things to feed back on. So I don't know, Sal, Councillor Venner, Councillor Pryor, if you've got any final thoughts you wanted to make before we move on that, and then if the board are agreeable with those things.
The only comment I wanted to make was in response to that, Chair, that I think that's a really good idea, and because we haven't been able to give much detail at this meeting about the green space priority because it's brand new, we can have more of a focus on that than the other priorities at the next meeting, because yeah, we can look at planning and green space, because we'll have people from parks involved in that as well as planning, so maybe they could come too. But thank you for all your contributions. I don't feel the need to say any more, given we've got some other lengthy agenda items. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry to come in uninvited, Chair, but I'd just like to make the immediate suggestion that we include children and green spaces in the programme of training for planning panel members, which is quite extensive but hasn't featured either of those things thus far.
Yep, good point. So, Angela, if we can capture that in the letter as well, please. And I don't, Councillor Pryor or Sal, is there anything you want to contribute before we move on?
I'm happy with that, with those suggestions. Just thanks to everybody for their contributions.
Thank you. And just I'll take it, unless I see hands shooting up, that everybody's happy with those suggestions and that approach going forward. And Angela, can I just check that you've got everything you need from that item?
I do, Chair, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on to item 4, which is the COVID-19 update on learning. we've got all the same contributors. Everybody's introduced themselves. There might be one or two people disappearing, but I'll hand over to Councillor Pryor initially, and then Sal to give us a brief introduction, and then we can go into questions and comments on this item.
Fab, thank you, Chair. So obviously schools have since returned since our last meeting. It's been a reasonable start back at school. Over the past week, a lot of them have kind of been staggered. A lot of schools have had inset days, and the schools are all back now. We've had no reports of schools being closed, so we think things have gone relatively smoothly. I suspect kind of the biggest issue most people will have on their minds will be the announcement from the government yesterday that children aged 12 to 15 will be able to get their first COVID vaccine shortly. Given this announcement was only yesterday, we don't really have much more beyond that to update the board on, other than that we're working with public health and the CCG and awaiting further guidance from the government on that. Obviously over the summer we've had the big learning conversations, the details of which are in the report, and this is kind of setting out a new set of priorities to establish following COVID. So we're refreshing the 3 A's, the attainment, attendance, achievement. These are still the priorities of the council, but obviously we've got quite a large, the past 18 months will have significantly changed. We'll need to kind of refocus that. As a council, we're still supporting schools with regular meetings with leaderships, proactive and reactive COVID support. And there was a comment earlier from, I think it was Celia, who mentioned kind of closures and the amount that children have missed over the past 18 months. And across the UK, it's an average of missing 115 days of education. And I think quite a lot of the time, a lot of that conversation is around very much the formal attainment that children are missing out on. But I do just want to talk briefly around some of that poverty of opportunity that Councillor Flint mentioned earlier, and actually those key experiences that a lot of children and young people will have missed, and how different they're going to be in different parts of the city. You know, they'll be missing out on those cultural experiences, those social experiences. There was a great, I think the university are doing a study at the moment on a programme called In Harmony that Opera North are doing, which is kind of taking music and instruments into schools and working with children, working with primary school children on this. They're by no means the only project like this. We ourselves as a council run them as well. But there was a clear impact, not only on the children's mental health of having this kind of cultural experience, but actually their attainment in maths and English rose as well. And I think it really just demonstrates the benefit of kind of those cultural experiences that children have in schools. And I think that is one of the key things that children will have missed out on, and a key part of the catch-up going forward. I don't know if this is something the board want to look more deeply at to kind of make sure children are kind of equally receiving those experiences. But to me, that's something I'm quite keen I'll be looking at over the next, the next coming months and years. Thanks. I'll pass on to Sal now.
Councillor Pryor, I mean, I think Councillor Pryor's covered most of it really quite comprehensively there, but I mean, I guess on the learning side, just reflecting back over the last 18 months and what a completely unprecedented set of circumstances we've been through, and what we've tried to do as a local authority is really support schools with managing with when vulnerable children and key worker children were in, and helping them through the different phases of the pandemic in terms of children coming back into school full time, trying to support them with digital access when they were remote learning. When you start to look back, you can kind of see different phases and the enormous effort that our schools community and school staff have made, all of the staff in schools to support children and young people through the pandemic. And the same goes for our early years providers, in the same way as I described earlier on in terms of our engagement with them. We've had very strong engagement with schools from right across the spectrum, and I have to say we've had lots of positive feedback about the support that they have felt through that period, and I think that gave us a great opportunity towards the end of term to bring together different leaders in the learning part of the world, primary school heads, secondary school heads, post-16 providers and early years providers, really to look at what we need to do in this next phase. And it's difficult to predict what's going to happen. There's already talk about whether or not there needs to be more restrictions back in place, given the rates at which COVID is increasing across the country. So it's still an unpredictable place to be, really. And so whilst we're trying to plan ahead, and we are pulling together that learning strategy and a strategy around special education needs and disabilities, that is in a very changing environment. And in some ways, having written this report and then arrived today at the meeting, things have changed even in that very short space of time. But as Councillor Pryor said, schools back in, bit of a staggered start for some of them last week, but everybody was in by Wednesday, Thursday, and are doing okay. But it remains to be seen how the infection rates progress now. And we are awaiting further guidance, working very closely with the CCG and Public Health on the 12 to 15-year-olds. But we are taking our relationships and engagement that we've had with the learning part of the world into this next term. So we will be communicating heavily with them in just in the same way as we were previously, and responding and supporting them as much as possible. Some of that leadership will clearly be provided by our new Deputy Director, Shaheen, who's in post now, which will again strengthen the response and support to the learning sector from the local authority.
Thank you, Sal. And I was going to ask Shaheen if you wanted to say anything by way of introduction at this point.
Thank you, Councillor Lamb. I think Sal and Councillor Pryor have covered the main points really, but I think it's great to see that our schools have been very keen to start back in a very smooth and calm manner. Our children have been very positive coming back to school. I think they've been very keen to get back in their friendship circles with their peers and start learning again. We have had some concerns from leaders, and what we're doing is very resolute in making sure that the open door policy remains in place for supporting our schools to feel supported in their decision-making processes. So all the avenues and platforms that we have to enable our schools to feel supported in managing the risks and mitigation are still in place, because as Sal said, that was a very positive outlook from our schools when we had conversations with them prior to the summer, and those will remain. And what the priority will be now is just to make sure that, again, that support is very focused on the vaccinations and making sure that we are supporting schools with the guidance that's coming through the CCG public health teams, and make sure that the disruption is as low as possible to learning. And that's the main sort of headlines there.
Okay, thank you for that, Shaheen. So who would like to kick off with questions, please? Celia first, please.
Thank you. Sal, you referred to the coming autumn, winter and the possible impact of COVID and trying to keep schools open, and I sincerely hope we can do. One of the biggest things that seems to be affecting the passing of the virus from one person to another is ventilation, even more so than contact on handles and surfaces and things like that. But our school estate is probably not geared up to being as well ventilated as is required. Is there anything that you're able to do that is being done? I know this is more health and safety, but I mean, that's really surrounding the whole problem of COVID.
Sal, did you want to come back on that?
I think Dave can come in on it in terms of the detail with the schools.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Yeah, the ventilation is one of the issues around, and that schools will have an issue with. And actually, at the moment, you know, it's relatively still decent weather, so windows and doors can all be open. As we move into winter, I think we're very aware that actually that becomes much more of a challenge for schools. So we're working with health and safety teams are working with schools to provide as much advice as we can. We're very conscious through the meetings with DFE, with RSC, with public health, that we're raising that issue because schools need further guidance. They need more support on that ventilation. There's CO2 monitors that they're discussing in terms of bringing those into schools. We had a meeting with DFE colleagues and public health colleagues this week about that, and we've pushed, you know, for more guidance and clarity on how those will be rolled out to schools and how they'll be utilised. So, Celia, I think we're very aware that it's an issue. It's going to be a challenge for schools, not just in Leeds, but right across the country. And I think from our point of view, we just need to keep pushing on all our channels that we've got to get further information and guidance from DFE and public health.
Okay, thanks for that, Dave. Councillor Heselwood is next, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to go back to where Councillor Pryor was talking about children missing on average 115 days of learning now over the last 18 months. What I want to ask about is I understand all the measures put in place, and hopefully we will have no or very little disruption this academic year compared to the last 2 academic years. But what I do want to ask about and ask how we're going to tackle this is the GCSE exams that are going to be taken this year. I will declare an interest because my son's got into year 11, and I will say I'm extremely worried for him and all the other year 11s. You know, that are going into year 11 now, that are going to have to take their GCSEs. We've had 2 years of teachers predicting grades, and obviously those grades have been going up. We've seen that, and that's not a bad thing. You know, teacher assessment is not a bad thing in my opinion. However, the government have said that we're going to go back to exams this year, and we are going to see those exam results drop this year as a result. He took his mock exams in July. They're not as good as we were expecting because of the last 18 months disruption, and that's a child who's had a place to learn at home, you know, quiet space, you know, with a desk and a laptop and everything else. So we've got children out there who haven't had that. Haven't had those facilities to learn as well. So I'm really concerned about these year 11s now and their GCSEs. They are going to have to sit exams. They haven't done all the learning they need to do. You know, the government haven't said anything yet about this other than they are going to sit exams. We know it's going to have an impact on grades because of the teacher assessment and then going back to the exams because of this 115 days of learning that these young people have missed. And they've also missed out on things like doing the Duke of Edinburgh Award, which would have had on the CV to go on to sixth form college and apprenticeships, that kind of thing. So they've missed a lot of other things as well, which would have helped them, you know, in their post-16 career as well, as the other 2 years have as well. I understand that. So yeah, I just want to know how we're going to tackle that and what we're going to put in place and how we're going to help our children, and also are we going to write to the government as well to express our concerns on this.
Councillor Lamb, my question was very closely related to that. May I ask it before there's a response?
Go ahead, Councillor Gruen.
Yeah, I was going to say many of the things that Councillor Heselwood has said, but just to add, you clearly, I guess the authority will have a view about the results this year, and as I say, they're looking positive. How well will those results serve the young people who now have them, and what kind of value will they have in the job market? But I'm also keenly interested in all of the other things that Jules asked about.
Okay, Erica, you look poised to respond.
I'm poised to respond. So first of all, there was a consultation at the end of last year between by Ofqual and the DFE about the exams in 2022. And what they're proposing in that consultation is that they will actually cut down on the amount of things that children will be examined on. and that will become public in January. And the reason for the lateness of that is because actually they don't want to lead to any curriculum narrowing before then. So the emphasis is on schools to try and teach, schools and colleges to try and teach as much as they can of the specification of the syllabus. But in January to say, right, these are the things that will be examined. These are the things that there will be questions on. So at that point, schools and colleges can have a more focused look at certain areas. So that that is still, that consultation is now closed, but the results of that have not come out. But that looks like the most likely thing, so that it won't be quite as a broader scope that children will be examined on, so to make it easier for them. There is quite a clamour at the moment for a plan B in case examinations can't go ahead, because that is the government's preferred option, is to have examinations. So a number of unions are asking for that, and obviously we would support a plan B. Quite a lot of schools and colleges, following on from last year, are doing a series of up-to-date mocks, so not just be reliant on results from last year, but from having examined evidence this year, so that they can draw on that should they have to make should they have to use evidence to support teacher grades. The question of grades this year, or well, in 2022, there is two sort of camps at the moment. One is that they should go back to the way that they were before in 2019, in the same kind of numbers, if you like. There's also an argument that there should be a sort of gradual move to the 2019 grading system, so that the 2022 cohort are not disadvantaged. It's fraught with difficulty, and to answer Councillor Gruen's question, to be honest, I can't yet answer that question. You know, I think we don't know how the grades of this year and last year will be will serve young people. It's a totally different system, and in some ways you could say that it could be that those are better indicators of what pupils can do and know, because they're based on teacher assessment and on evidence of work, as opposed to how they performed in an exam on 2 single days, for instance. But I don't think we'll know. In terms of employers making comparisons, I don't think that's ever been simple. You know, I think back, I did my exams in 1982, and apparently that was the lowest year ever for results, for A-level results. And I still think that, you know, I almost want to put that down every time I apply for anything. Do you realise how good these are? Because in comparison to what came afterwards. And we also have, you know, A's and A stars that have changed. So in some ways, the system has never been comparable for one year to another. That's not helpful for employers, but actually employers have never been totally aware of that. So it is fraught with difficulty, and there is no one answer to that.
Okay, thank you for that. And it might be something that we want to look at in a bit more detail, as we did last year. So perhaps members might want to reflect on that, whether it's worth, and officers, if it's too soon to be thinking, should we have a working group to just specifically to look at this again, as we did, perhaps with the intention of writing with our views to government, to feed into that conversation at an early stage, or whether we think it's too soon to do that.
Can I just interrupt, just to add to what Erica was just saying? I've just been emailed actually with the notification indication that the provisional timetables for next year's exam will be published in early October. So at that point, as Erica was saying, it will start to solidify a little more as to the shape and format, because the actual structure of the timetable gives you an indication of the nature of the exams themselves. So that will be it. And I would also, again, like to confirm what she's saying, that in most circumstances, the qualifications, whether they be GCSEs, vocational course, whatever, A-levels, they are passports to the next stage. They're very rarely sort of standalone assessment of the individual, and therefore GCSEs are in the main passports to the next level of level 3 provision, etc. So what happens there is that there isn't that, you know, you've got more A's than this or the other than the previous year group, or less than the one that will come next. It's just what it will enable that young person to move on to in the next stage. And Erica and I have both been examiners, and we know that they have this amazing process of normalising things, and they look at it, and essentially most times students will not be hard done by in that way, because nobody wants to see students be put at risk by that. So that's just my bit.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm going to go to Councillor Pryor, then Dave, and then there's a few other people waiting to contribute. So Councillor Pryor.
Just to kind of follow on from both previous speakers, Councillor Richards is absolutely right. Kind of examinations are, in the main part, that passport to the next stage. So the cohort that I'm actually most concerned about, and I think this will be a really useful area for the Scrutiny Board to look at, is not those necessarily studying GCSEs this year, but those studying A-levels next year and going into university. You may have seen in the news kind of how hugely oversubscribed universities were this year. And in fact, we had in Leeds the situation where, and this is repeated around the country, where the university was paying children to defer to the next year. So my real concern is that the places available in universities next year will be far fewer. And I think that's something that our HE sector really needs to be looking at right now, to make sure that those children doing A-levels at the end of this academic year still have those opportunities going forward.
Okay, thank you for that. Dave, please.
Councillor, yeah, I think a lot of the points have been picked up by Councillor Richards and Councillor Pryor. And just to reflect on your point about sort of the scrutiny, it was very useful, I think, last year, the officers working with Scrutiny and Councillor Pryor in terms of the response to the plans for examinations. I think Councillor Richards mentioned that in October there'll be more information, and that's probably a time where we can reflect and think about what's the opportunity to work together to look at that whole process and the impact.
Okay, thank you for that. Kate was next, please.
Thank you. Just wanted to ask a question about the vaccinations for 12 to 15-year-olds. Which was obviously touched upon earlier, and I think there was reference to guidance for schools coming through from the CCG and health. And just thinking from the perspective of a parent of an almost 13-year-old, and knowing that that's quite a tricky age group, and that those young people may well have, in some cases, quite strong views and opinions about the vaccination and whether they should have it or not, whether it's right that they should have it when people in other parts of the world haven't yet had it, etc. So I just wondered to what extent schools, if you could just give a bit more information about the extent to which schools will be supported in regards to those issues that might crop up within school, because I know schools obviously deliver the flu vaccination and the HPV, but this is obviously something completely new, which in adults has been delivered at mass vaccination centres or doctor surgeries and things. And to what extent will schools sort of be supported around potential issues and difficulties that might crop up with children and young people and their families, particularly where there might be a disagreement between the child and young person and their parents about whether they should have it or not, and schools' understanding of Gaelic competence and all of those issues? Because I could just see there might be a few tricky sort of scenarios in schools that staff might have to try and manage. And also,
Erica?
sorry. There was one other question, but I'll ask that one afterwards if that's okay.
Can I just come in first, Councillor Lam? Just
of course.
Just to say yes. Thanks, Kate. I think you're absolutely right that there will be a number of quite complex and difficult issues for people to work through. I think we, as a local authority, will be in a position where we receive some further guidance. We're in conversations and have been for a couple of weeks now with public health and with the CCG, and so we will come up with guidance and a mechanism to support schools to work through some of those issues. It will be a challenge, I think, because there could be extensive issues to deal with, but we've got all the communications routes set up. We've got DCS alert emails where schools can come in and make make inquiries with us, and as well as public health and the CCG, we also have our own health and safety team. So we'll be drawing on all of those. I think we just need to. The announcement is so recent that we just need to wait for further guidance to come through. I had a conversation with DFE yesterday about that, and then we'll move forward with it carefully. But it's obviously our intention to just support schools with some tricky decisions that they might have to make.
Thank you, Sal. Erica, did you want to add anything, or does that cover everything?
Just very briefly, we did hold a meeting last night for all secondary head teachers and 4 members of the Leeds vaccination programme. It was very well attended. There was an opportunity for the vast majority of the time for head teachers to ask questions. From that, we're producing a frequently asked questions sheet, which will hopefully go out on Friday. And the NHS provided a single point of contact for the vaccination programme for head teachers, and the discussion about difficult situations did come up, and that was discussed. So I think we are well underway of supporting head teachers with the difficulties that they may face.
I think just worth adding on as well, Erica, that the NHS and the vaccination teams within the local authorities are keeping us as children's services involved in all their comms and discussions. So there's quite a good link up, Kate, in terms of us understanding what they're doing and them asking for our feedback as well to work together jointly.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Kate, did you say you had another question as well?
Yeah, thanks very much for that. That's really helpful and reassuring. The other question was just really quickly about transitions, because we've talked about that previously and how sort of the previous year that we're transitioning into high school and into sixth form and beyond and things, it was quite difficult for them because there wasn't enough time to kind of prepare them, and we were obviously very much in the midst of just coming out of the first lockdown, and we're a bit further forward in the pandemic now. So I just wondered, we talked previously about what lessons might have been learned from that cohort's experiences, and whether you had any feedback about how transitions had been this year. And I think it's probably, I would imagine, been better because there's been the possibility, I think, in some cases of children being able to actually go on site and visit. But just sort of, yeah, it was just thought it'd be helpful just to do a bit of a compare and contrast and see if you had any observations or any information to share that might be relevant.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'll go to Dave first, then Erica, please.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I think the transition has been improved this year, I think, because schools have made it a real priority in terms of being their focus. To, they understand the impact that a poor transition has on those young people, to settle them in quickly into their new phase of learning. Lots of our bronze meetings with the schools, both secondary and primary, were focused around transition. So lots of schools sharing their the ways that they were doing transition, sharing that good practice, sharing ideas. There was, one of our primary schools and our secondary had been working on an area-wide sort of transition where they were doing lots of academic things between the secondaries and the primaries. Still, I think this year, schools have absolutely sunk themselves into that sort of virtual world as well. So they've utilised where they've been able to do on-site activities, transition activities. Where they haven't, they've got great sort of like virtual tours of the school, meet the head of year, and all that sort of stuff. So I think, schools have been incredible, and school leaders have been incredible through this whole pandemic, and actually have just risen to the challenge time and time again. And actually, you can see it's not been perfect in terms of transition. Far from it. We wouldn't want the pandemic, but actually they've again sort of risen to that challenge of knowing that that's a key priority for them to get right, because they want that really settled start. So I think it's been better, and I think there's been a lot of hard work and effort put in. I think that transition will, as they've got, say for example, the year 7s in now, there's a big focus from our secondary colleagues to actually make the time now in school even more impactful. And I think as we move through the year, in terms of, we don't know we hope for a settled academic year. We don't know what the bumps in the road are going to be, but actually as part of our discussions with secondary and primary colleagues, that transition will still remain a focus for us to share that practice and to talk about how best we can do it. But like I say, I think overall, the schools have done a really good job to try and make it as effective as possible as they can. Erica, is there anything else I haven't picked up on there?
Yeah, I'll be brief. Dave's absolutely right. We've made transition a big focus this year. At 16 plus, we established a Leeds agreement. We're very grateful to Leeds City College who led on that, basically establishing a set of principles that we wanted leaders in Leeds to sign up to about how to take into account individual circumstances of pupils, how they might have been affected by COVID, for instance, encouraging a phone conversation or something about an individual, and quite a lot of schools did sign up to that, so there was discussion around that. We also made some developments in terms of the transfer of safeguarding information, because what we didn't want is young people who'd experienced difficulties in their school for their college not to be aware of that, and for that to lead to them to drop out. Because exam results were, all the teacher assessment grades were submitted on about the 12th of June, if I remember correctly, we did have a big push with schools to say, can you use the rest of that time meaningfully to do progression activities with pupils, with young people? And a lot of them were doing those kind of activities, making sure they had a positive destination, but also worked on developing their CVs, their interview skills, etc. At the transfer from primary school to secondary school, Dave's right, we had one family of school where we're doing a project around the Tempest, which was very interesting. That was in primarily, I think it was the Northwest group of schools.
Really bias area, wasn't it? As well?
Yeah, with Lawnswood Leeds City Academy as well. And we also did some work with schools about data transfer, because obviously there were no SATs. So we actually thought that some of the information that we were encouraging primary schools to give to secondary schools was more meaningful about what pupils could actually do and not do. And finally, we did work about transition into reception. We had something like such as the reception reading project with 13 schools, which kind of basically encouraged reception children, or who were going to be reception children, to read a selection of books and meet other children who would be in their class at the local library for those books. So I hope that's given you a flavour of the type of work we were doing around transition.
Okay, thank you for that, Erica. So I'm going to take the final contribution from Councillor Marshall Catung, and then we'll sum up on this item. I'm going to propose that we have a very short comfort break before we move on to the final item on the agenda. So Councillor Marshall-Catung, please.
Thank you, Chair, and my apologies, I had to dip out of the meeting and I'm back now. So Councillor Pryor has actually touched on what I would like to say in terms of the cohort for year 13. So if we all know that year, those who are in year 13 now are the first year who did not write GCSEs in 2020 and now will be writing A-levels. Councillor Richards also mentioned about concession. If we look at the trend and what's going on, and my concern here is our children who are, in terms of equality, are far from one end to the other. So, and Councillor Hesselwood did say we have children, and for example, my kid, yes, again, my kids are in the cohort I'm talking about. So my twin boys are in year 13, but as a mother, and obviously I am able, the days that they have been at home, and I've spent 40 days in isolation because of 2 of them. So that's 2 of them as well, not being in school for 40 days, but I'm able to get them extra tuition to ensure that they're still studying whilst at home. But we will have so many children in that same position as my boys without digital access, without the comfort that in their homes like mine would have, and will not have the same learning as their mates in school, and will now have to go back this September. They're going to be writing mocks in October. A lot will determine for predictive grading that they're going to be sending to universities for them to be making applications next year. So with all of these things that has happened, universities have not changed what their requirements will be. So my problem is how we're going to bridge the gap for those children who will fall behind for so many reasons. Of course, COVID is definitely one huge part of it, and the inequalities that children from less privileged backgrounds will have to suffer come April, May next year when they're writing their A-levels, and then they need to get into university for September and will not have the grades they would have had if everything was normal. So that's the concern that I have at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that, Councillor Marshall-Catung. So who can respond to that? And then I'm going to wrap up on this item because I'm just conscious of the time. Dave, is it you?
Yeah, I mean, there are real issues, Councillor, in terms of the impact and the COVID pandemic will have had on different sections of the communities and to different children. One of the things that schools are working hard on at the moment, and will be supporting with that, is in terms of that catch-up fund, in terms of the one-to-one tuition, for example, in terms of identifying those young people that have suffered significantly, that have fallen behind and may not have had digital access. And I think that one of the good things that I think the government have changed their advice on is in terms of, rather than just using the one-to-one tuition fund for external support for those young people, schools can then choose to utilise it within school, so they could actually have teachers that know them well to actually provide that sort of that catch-up one-to-one funding. So I think that's a real step forward that gives schools much more control over, or much more say over what those young people really need to actually push them on. I think in terms of I think you're right, particularly going forward, we don't know what's going to happen, that I think that push still needs to be on the digital access for all young people, so that if they, we don't know if there's going to be periods of self-isolation still going down in the future, so they need that access, and the Digital Leeds campaign will carry on pushing that as well. I think, Erica, the DfE have extended the digital access licenses for those young people as well. Am I right in thinking?
Yes, Dave. So basically, all the laptops provided by the DfE now have security controls on them, which will last till the end of August 2022.
And I think just on a final point in that, I think schools are very aware as part of their development plans, schools and academies, in working with those children that have suffered significantly. And I think that really is their priority. All the discussions we have with school leaders is about how do we mitigate the impact that those young people have had on their education. So it's not easy, but I think there's a determination I sense from the sector that actually that's their priority.
Thank you. Councillor Richards, if it's an ultra quick point, I'll sneak you in before we sum up.
Thank you for sneaking. All I will say is that this is the time, as you're right, Councillor Catherine, for the UCAS applications. I'm in the process of doing it as we speak. And I'm also aware that staff are being amazing and they're very professional and they know their children. And they're asked to make a prediction. And they're asked to make a prediction based on that individual. And that's exactly what they do. And they give them those, and then the system will work its own way out. So my experience is that whilst there is obvious disparity between access to what has been going on, that the schools, the systems, the teachers, parents, students are all working together to lessen that impact and to give those young people the opportunities they deserve. End of.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, again, that's great. We've covered a lot of ground and a lot of useful things we've covered there. What I want to propose is that we look perhaps to have a working group in October that will enable us to look at the exams issues. Also, it would be useful perhaps to look at an update on the 3A's strategy at that point, and to discuss some of these wider issues around Year 13 and transition. And look at how we can respond and perhaps feed into government as we did last year. So, Councillor Pryor, Sal, are you happy with that approach? And is that something that would be useful to you? Yeah, I'm seeing nods. Sal?
Yeah, that's fine with me. I think we can. We're going to do the work schedule at the end, towards the end of the meeting as well, aren't we? So we can have a thought then about how we might, how the timing might work on all of that.
Okay, thank you. So Angela, have we got everything that we need for that item?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, that's fine. And as Sal said, we could do a bit of a recap at work schedule item.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we've got one more substantive item. I'm going to propose that we have a very quick 5-minute comfort break before we move on to that. So just in order to facilitate that, the webcast will still be going on. There'll be a slide that goes up just to say we're adjourned. So if everyone would make sure they're muted and your camera is off until we start again. Otherwise, the whole World Wide Web will be able to hear everything that you're saying and doing for the next 5 minutes. So I make it 11:57, so at 12:02 we'll be getting going again. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Now the slides down, we can get back on. So we're moving on to item 5, which is an update on the Ofsted focused visit, and it seemed appropriate to bring this to the board at the earliest opportunity, which is why it's on the agenda today. Many members will be aware it was discussed in full council yesterday, and everyone can make their own view about that debate, but just to remind, this is obviously, we're very keen to keep the political stuff out of the scrutiny board because it's not helpful to our discussions. So I'll ask both in those contributing and board members that we just keep that in mind. And one thing I would say on that is, as someone who's been involved in this board for most of the last 15 years, and there are a few other members who've been around for a long time, right through the many journeys of children's services. I'm very proud, and I think we should all be proud of the role that this board has played in that improvement journey. And it's absolutely our role to work with the department, the executive members and Sal to make sure that we're always trying to improve from whatever level we're at. And so it's in that context that we're having this discussion, and I'd just ask everybody to keep it to the right tone, I think, is what I'm looking for. So if I can ask Sal and Councillor Venner just to introduce the reports. The main purpose for us is to consider what further action, if any, the scrutiny board want to take into looking into this and monitoring this, and it'd be useful just to hear Sal and Councillor Venner's thoughts on that as well, please, when you're introducing the report.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I'm going to just do some overview comments, and then Sal will fill in a bit of detail, particularly about the improvement action plan. I'm really aware that for elected members, some of this will be repetitive in terms of what I said yesterday, but obviously this is a calmer version. I really respect the points you've made, Chair, about tone. So this is a focused visit that is part of the framework for how children's services are inspected. And it always happens between main inspections. So we were last fully inspected in 2018, and we do another inspection this year, although it might end up being early next year. And you have a focused visit in between. So it's a 2-day visit with 2 inspectors. For a full inspection, you'd have more like between 9 and 12 inspectors. They'd be in for about a week. So on the visit, they looked at about 20 cases. In a full inspection, it will be literally a few hundred. So it's a snapshot and focused on the front door to children's social work. And it doesn't result in a judgment for the authority. You get a letter of recommendations for improvement, which means we still hold our outstanding Ofsted judgment, and will do until we're re-inspected when they'll make a new judgment. So the inspectors have identified areas for improvement, which they always do. So even when we got our outstanding judgment, we still had recommendations for improvement as part of that. I'm really, really mindful of what you said about tone, Chair, so I'm not trying to be provocative saying this, but obviously I'm really aware, Councillor Stevenson wrote to you, where he copied you into the letter to me, and I've responded to that, which you've seen. His letter says, and his press release, that there's serious deficits in relation to child protection and safeguarding. What I really wanted to stress is that Ofsted didn't find any children to be at serious risk. There's 2 things they can do if they're concerned on a focused visit. So one is they do what's called referring cases back to you. So of the around 20 cases that they saw, if they thought any of those children, individual children, were at risk, they refer it back to us and say, can you look at this because we're concerned about whatever. Their kind of nuclear option, if they're really concerned at a focused visit, is they can trigger a full inspection, which they didn't do either. So the letter that you've seen outlines some key strengths for the service, including the continued investment in the provision of early help that's adapted to meet the needs of the pandemic, and ensured that children and families receive the services they need and are capped out of formal statutory interventions. The local authority and partners acted quickly to identify children and families most affected by the pandemic and made sure they got support. And they were very positive about the staff. They said, despite the pandemic, staff felt well supported. They talked really positively about the Leeds way of working. They said they were proud to work for Leeds. They made the point in the letter that children were seen by their own social worker throughout the pandemic, and I wanted to stress that's actually massive. If you think about the challenges of the pandemic in a city like Leeds, so badly hit by COVID, the fact that people were seen by their own social workers throughout the pandemic, I think that's probably something most authorities wouldn't be able to claim. And we don't use any agency staff, which again is a real change from where we were, say, 10 years ago when it was millions of pounds every year. So families were getting consistent service in terms of who they were seeing. So the Ofsted letter identified no areas of serious weakness. And that's really important to stress, that there were no areas of serious weakness. When we were inadequate, they were using language like widespread and systematic failure. That is not the language they're using now, but they did identify 3 recommendations where practice can be improved. So one was the quality and consistency of assessments to ensure information on family history is gathered and analysed to inform decision-making and the quality of children's plans. The second was the quality and impact of management oversight and supervision to ensure that decisions are timely and well recorded. And the third is the quality and independence of audits to ensure they provide learning to support improvement in social work practice and provide senior managers with an understanding of the quality of that practice. I was in the feedback meeting with Ofsted, which was at the end of the inspection. So we met in person at Merrion House. And there's absolutely no doubt that consistency was a major theme. That was the thing that most jumped out at me. And when they were talking about things like management oversight, it wasn't saying managers aren't properly overseeing work. It was saying they're not fully recording their rationale for things. And similarly with the point on supervision, they weren't saying supervision's not happening. They weren't saying it's not effective. It's not providing that kind of therapeutic reflection and appropriate, holding social workers to account. They were saying it's not being thoroughly enough recorded. So it felt like quite a lot of the recommendations were quite process orientated. They were not saying there's bad practice, and they were not saying children are placed at risk, but they were saying, some of the plans are written better than others, some are too narrative, supervision's not being consistently recorded in the same way. And it felt like we will be able to pull this back. And I would say at this point that both myself and the administration and the directorate fully accept the recommendations. They weren't a massive surprise in terms of the context of the pandemic and the fact that although social workers have been seeing children and families when they need to and going into homes, they haven't been with each other as much as they were pre-pandemic. And it felt like a lot of this we will be able to pull back when people are back in their offices together. And I was reflecting on my own experience of managing services, although it's quite different, because I used to manage mental health crisis services, as some of you know. And I was thinking, actually, I'm not sure I could have delivered a consistent service if I didn't have loads of contact with my team and we weren't all together a lot. So it did feel like a lot of this we will be able to pull back, and a lot of it's about people having been working from home and not been all together. There's some details I will be able to talk about in more depth about things like the strategy discussions, the comments around domestic abuse. They did acknowledge that we've introduced a daily multi-agency meeting to strengthen that response, but that it was too early at the point they came to note the impact of that. So children's services are already, we've got an improvement plan, and we're working with relevant partners on that, because the strategy discussions, for example, that's us, the police and health. In response also to Councillor Stevenson's letter, where we talked about other authorities, we have always sought expertise from other authorities and from leading academic social workers in terms of the developments of best practice. It's one of our great strengths. We look locally, nationally, internationally, but I would stress here that we are the only city that's outstanding, and only about 7 or 8 areas in the country have outstanding, and the others are much smaller and much more affluent. So Councillor Stevenson talked yesterday quite a lot about North Yorkshire. I do know my equivalent in North Yorkshire. I do already work with her a bit, because there's a regional meeting for lead members for children in Yorkshire and Humber, and we also both sit on the National Local Government Association Children and Young People's Board. And North Yorkshire is outstanding. It's the closest authority to us that's outstanding. It's really tiny compared to Leeds, and a really different demographically. We do always look to other authorities and to other theorists and other practitioners in terms of best practice. In terms of scrutiny, we're really happy to be accountable to you and to report regularly on the action plan. We do fully accept the recommendations, and we are, working to be back where we would want to be when Ofsted come back for a full inspection. One of the things I am concerned about, and I really, although obviously full council is a theatrical space where, we behave differently to how we do when we're in groups like this, I do have some concerns that the way this has been presented is not helpful and has the capacity to demoralise staff who are working under massive, immense pressure, and really have gone above and beyond throughout the pandemic, from our amazing foster carers to our social workers. And I do feel it's really important going forward that we approach this focused visit in a constructive and collaborative way, that recognises that actually the Ofsted letter is pretty balanced. So it has some really clear recommendations for improvement, which we fully accept, but it also has some really positive comments. And we've been on a really amazing improvement journey over the last 10 years. And I just don't want that to be undermined by the way some of this has been presented. I'll end there, Chair. Thank you. And obviously we're really open to questions and comments, but I know Sal can fill in some of the detail around the improvement plan. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Vera, and I'm very grateful for the tone that you've struck to start the debate off with. I really do appreciate it, and I hope from my perspective, what I'm looking for is that we have a calm and collaborative response to this. It's quite right that we look at it as a scrutiny board and do our work as a critical friend, but both of those two words are key in that. We're here as a friend. We want to keep that improvement journey going, and it's just finding the right mechanisms for the scrutiny board to support that work and to make sure that staff do feel valued and supported. And I'm sure I'll see nods going round, but from the scrutiny board, we can say loud and clear that we do really appreciate and value the work that they do, and recognise how difficult it's been. So if there was any doubt, then please take it that's our position as a scrutiny board. So I'll bring Sal in now.
Thanks, Councillor Lamb. I will, if that's okay, just do a couple of things around context to add to what Councillor Venner has said. And the inspection itself took place at the end of July. People will be aware, in the last week of school term, and just as the restrictions were being lifted on the 21st of July. But prior to the inspection, we'd invited in colleagues from around the region to undertake a peer review, and they, in addition to what was looked at by Ofsted, they looked at a number of cases as well. And again, there was nothing from that was sent back. In some ways, the feedback from that peer review was made fully available to Ofsted, so that they utilised some of that in terms of the judgments that they made. And in some ways, the lead from that peer review said to me, "You've got all the hard bits that people find really difficult in place, and but there's just these bits that are some of these process things that are that need a bit of attention." And I would say, we have been through a massive pandemic. I'm sat here in Merrion House. I was sat here with the inspector during the inspection and pointed to places like Little London, which 2 weeks prior to the inspection had 1,600 per 100,000 rate of infections, and that includes the children, the families and the communities that we work in, but it also impacts on our staff. And within the service, you know, we have had people who have passed away from COVID who have been impacted upon significantly, or their partners or families have been significantly impacted upon, like everybody has. And I think that we just have to have that context in mind when we look at this. And given that context, Ofsted were very positive about our early help arrangements, which, whilst they're saying are well-resourced, they're well-resourced because of the strategy that we've been on for 10 years, where we've been able to move away from more statutory interventions to creating a much more of a preventative and helpful and supportive system for those families where that's what's needed. You know, staff felt proud to work for Leeds. They talked about understanding the model and understanding the Leeds practice model. And even through all those difficulties, they talked about how well supported they've been. Now, we have, you know, 3 recommendations that we are working on. We always have a service improvement plan that runs all of the time, because we're constantly trying to improve things, and obviously from the peer review and from the inspection we've adjusted those improvement plans to deal directly with some of the issues, but many of them are things that we were working on. And the first one around the quality and consistency of assessments is a bit like the Forth Road Bridge. You do some training and development with people, and over a period of time people move on. You have new staff come in place and you have to go back around it again and again, really. So we are constantly working on how we improve that level of consistency and the quality, and it's often about the analysis. And sometimes what you've got are assessments that are a bit more descriptive. So we have master classes where we invite academics in to come and support our staff with how they do that that analysis, but actually how they record that analysis is often a greater challenge. When Ofsted have been to inspections previously, they sit down and talk to the social workers, and in that conversation they tend to get the analysis that might not have been as fully recorded or as effectively recorded as that person understands the circumstances that they're working in. So it is something that we continue to work on. We've got plans in place for additional practice forums and practice cafes that are being led by senior leaders and by our principal social workers, and we're putting some additional capacity in there to support people with that work. The quality and impact of management oversight, I think there were certain circumstances in terms of a number of matters that were being dealt with as the inspectors were on site, where somebody had talked to the inspectors about a live case, and they were going away to record the rationale afterwards, but it wasn't there at the point that they were talking to the inspectors. But we have had a closer look at that, and we've got a clear process in place now, so that the decision making, as Councillor Benner said, is logged because it's done as part of the system. There's an additional bit that we are that we're supporting staff to do, which is putting down the rationale behind the decision making. And then the third recommendation is around the quality and independence of audits. We have had a large number of audits that have been undertaken, and through the pandemic, people have been auditing cases that sit within their team. We do have some moderation processes that inspectors weren't really here long enough to see, but we accept that we need to do more cross auditing, so we've put that in place, and from this month that's what's happening with all of the audits. There's a cross audit process in place where teams have been paired with each other in order to undertake audits in other teams, and there's a layer of moderation that takes place by service managers, and then a moderation process that's undertaken by the heads of service. All of that we have in place mechanisms to pull together what the themes are and the learning is. And we have been sending out a bulletin that goes out to all staff that identifies those themes. So again, we are strengthening that, drawing out the themes from those audits and then communicating that with staff so that it can impact on their practice. I mean, we have also had multi-agency audits that are independent, and we work, so we have something called the Joint Targeted Area Inspection, which runs along the themes that Ofsted are inspecting on, and we use that as a multi-agency group to undertake case audit activity, which is on a multi-agency basis. But we also have a audit process that comes through the Leeds Safeguarding Children's Partnership. So I think one of the areas that we're going to strengthen is how do we pull all the themes from all those different areas regularly into a report, and then use the communication mechanism that I have described. We've got a detailed action plan. I won't go through all of that now, but in each of those areas to really help us to strengthen that consistency of the quality, which is what's being pointed to by Ofsted. The other issue that has come up is the issue around strategy discussions involving all three partners, and again, this is something that we worked on following the last inspection in 2018, and we've seen some improvements in this area. Again, we just have to consider the context in which people are trying to undertake those discussions within 24 hours of a referral coming in, when you have got across all agencies significant pressures arising out of the pandemic. So how do you get a social worker, police officer and a health visitor to have that conversation very quickly within that 24-hour period? And we have been managing that in the few weeks that the Ofsted we're looking at, we have been managing that in around 47% of circumstances. But again, as people come back into the office and you've got people physically being based together, that will improve. We've put significant measures in place to improve that, and we have week on week since the inspection seen an increase where all three partners are part of the strategy discussions. And from last week, we've also implemented an escalation process where that doesn't happen, so that we can very quickly on a daily basis be picking up what those issues are. And as I say, as people are, as the restrictions have been lifted and people are back in the office much more, there's much more face-to-face work going on. We will see that continue to significantly improve very quickly, but we've also set in place a longer term look at whether there are other ways in which we can improve the process around the strategy discussions. So overall, what I would say is that we accept the areas for improvement that Ofsted have outlined. We've got a plan that is very quickly onto this. We're focused on bringing those improvements about, but we're also building on the strengths that they identified in the inspection as well.
Okay, thank you for that. So we've had a very comprehensive introduction. I've got a few hands, and just being mindful, our focus is on what is the response and further work that the board might want to do. So that's sort of really what I'm looking for people to reflect on in their comments. So Councillor Gruen, please.
Thank you. And absolutely taking on board the tone and calmness that we're looking for. The comments that I'm going to make are offered in an entirely constructive mode. So what I would say, having listened to the introduction, is that I would just push back a little bit on whether or not the areas for improvement are largely process driven, because my reading of the letter and the wording that's used, if supervision is not reflective and audits are not of the same quality and consistency, then I would suggest that it's more than just process that we need to be looking at. But and indeed, you've covered a lot of what you're planning to do about those areas. But the findings of the report do make it clear that those areas for development have declined since the initial inspection or the last inspection. So my question to Sal is, why have they declined? And is it because we've got different staff? Is it because we've lapsed on the training? Why have we had something in place and then it's got a little bit worse? That would be the signal that the letter would say to me. That would be the root of my concern. In an entirely constructive and positive way, I'd be asking those questions of myself. The second point is that how disappointing that the police and the NHS have not been there at assessments and case reviews. I wonder why that is. Were they attending regularly last time? And could that be an easy win? I mean, should we invent consequences for people not being in attendance at those? Because that, again, seems a pretty serious gap, which is not entirely of our making. And perhaps we need to look at ways in which we can bring that clearly under our control. The other question I had in mind really was just, and I think it'll be addressed at the conclusion of the debate, how will Scrutiny monitor and support this? Well, I'm guessing the action plan will continue to come back. And it does say in the report that the findings of the report will be taken account of in planning the next inspection visit. Do we have any understanding of what this level of report and the language in this report, what kind of trigger that might have on the next planned inspection, please?
Chair, could I respond in like a couple of sentences and then pass over?
Yeah, go ahead.
In terms of why things have declined, actually the pandemic is a massive factor in that. And it was frustrating that it felt like they didn't actually really take that into account fully. And I'm saying that with regard to both the verbal feedback that we had at the meeting and the letter. Both the verbal meeting and the letter started by saying, we know there's a context of a pandemic, and then continued as if there wasn't. And actually, comparing us to North Yorkshire, as happened yesterday, the impact on us has been massively different of the pandemic. I think this is obviously a national issue, not just a Leeds issue. And I know that from obviously some of the work that I do nationally, that it's a frustration for people generally that the Ofsted regulatory framework hasn't changed. Although they're saying we know this pandemic, actually the framework they're using is the same and doesn't reflect that. So, I mean, Sal will be able to respond to you more fully. That's one response from me. With regard to Ofsted coming back, in some ways, although obviously it's disheartening getting a letter that's got critical feedback as well as positive feedback, it's also really helpful because it does direct us very clearly to the areas that we need to improve before the next inspection. You know, it's much better that this happened than that they just came back and did a full inspection. So we've got a really clear plan of where we need to improve, and those will be the first areas they'll go to. So we do know they're the areas we need to tighten up on, because that's the first thing they'll look at when they come back. So in that respect, it's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Gruen. I think Councillor Benner has answered those 2 points. I do think that I think one of the issues when they came in 2018 for the full inspection, as we've said, they were here for a longer period of time and there were a lot more inspectors, so they got into a greater level of depth to see what practice looked like. This is a snapshot of a smaller subset of what they're looking at. But the day before the inspection, the front door team, for example, came together in person in preparation for meeting the inspectors the following day, and one of them tested positive, so the whole team had to self-isolate, and therefore all of those interviews that then took place had to be done remotely. That's just one simple example of how different it would be. In the 2018 inspection, they would have been here at Marian House, and downstairs from where I am on the 6th floor is where the front door team sits. You would have had team managers, social workers, police colleagues, our early help colleagues and our health colleagues who were there in person, and they could see and experience what that multi-agency working looks like. Now, in some ways, the communication that you can do on Zoom and Teams does help with some of that interaction, but it's not the same as seeing it absolutely in person. And as I tried to set that context in what I said in my introduction about the fact that how much people have been impacted upon during this period of time, and we are seeing now as people are back in the office and the teams are together, we're seeing how that is having a positive impact on the practice, on the communication, on the support that people can get. I think you can have supervision, and people have been doing supervision and team meetings in a remote way. There is something about sitting face to face with somebody in a supervision session that is more qualitative and slightly different in the way that you respond. Normally what people will be doing is going out to visit children and families and coming back to an office space where there would be their peers, where there would be their manager. Many of these visits, people have gone out, done quite tricky visits and then gone home, and then you're waiting for an opportunity through the team's arrangements to speak to your manager about it. It is different in that context, and so when this talks about some of that, the consistency, it's not that these processes haven't been taking place, they have been, but it's the consistency of the quality, because they did say that many of those circumstances where that supervision has taken place has been reflective, and it's led to good outcomes for children and young people. But it's not consistently been that, and so we are working on that quality with our staff, as I've outlined.
Okay, thank you for that, Sal. So there's quite a few people want to contribute. I'm conscious of the time. I'm also conscious that I don't want to. I'm going to bring you back in a second, Councillor Gruen. I'm conscious also that I don't want to stifle the debate, but we usually try and finish at about 12:30. Clearly, we're not going to. So, but if people could keep their comments as brief as possible and focused on our next steps as best as we can. So in terms of order of speakers, Councillor Green, did you want to come back on those points quickly?
Just the point about the police and the NHS attending, that would be something we could do.
Sorry, yes, can I pick that up? I mean, I think we've got the different levels of engagement in each of those meetings by the different agencies that are involved, and sometimes it's I think we are working very closely with them. I've had conversations with the senior partners in the police and the health service. This issue, we've talked about it at the Safeguarding Children's Partnership, and people in a more operational roles are also working on this in absolute detail. So I want to reassure you that we've got commitment, absolute commitment from our health partners, absolute commitment from our police partners in terms of resolving this issue. Again, I will just point to the fact that we have been trying to manage some of this in a pandemic where people at times have been pulled away from their day-to-day responsibilities to respond on a more global level. And as that happens, sometimes some of these processes aren't able to be met. The health service continued to provide us with information in those circumstances where they might not have been able to immediately attend a strategy discussion. And given that the processes beyond that, Ofsted found to be absolutely in place in terms of child protection conferences, all of those things, then you did get an early engagement with all of the agencies in those processes. So we're all looking across the partnership together about what the barriers to this are. We've already seen an improvement since the inspection, and we're working hard to continue that further. So I'm confident that we've got the support we need from health and police partners.
Okay, thanks for that, Sal. And I wonder perhaps if part of our ongoing work looking at this, it might be useful to hear from those partners at some point. So Jackie's the next contributor, please.
Just one or two comments. Sometimes I feel sometimes we focus on the negatives too much. I'd just like to say that all children saw their social workers, and for each child to see a social worker over the last 18 months is a huge thing for each child. They weren't left, no child was in danger, and all our children were safe. And for me, that is the main thing for each child. All staff worked under very difficult circumstances over the last 2 years, and we have to see that in whatever comes up as well. You can't say we have to celebrate our positives as well as I know we have things to do, but we've come a long way in the last 10 years. I've been on the board just like, you know, requiring improvement. We've come a long way. Yes, we've got 3 or 4 things that we need to improve, but it's a lot better than where we were 10 years ago. So that's my comment, and that's all I want to say, really.
Thank you, Jackie. That's really helpful and appreciated, I'm sure. Councillor Richards is next, please.
Thank you, Chair. As Councillor Venner alluded to, the theatre of full council doesn't allow full stories sometimes to come out, and Ofsted is also a bit of a performance. I'm aware of that, and I think you made a really good point that the issues raised by the Ofsted letter make the focus so much easier and make it absolutely spot on for you to be easier to be done. My only question is about timescale. I know that it's been said that things are being addressed immediately, etc. I'd just be interested to know what the short, medium, and sort of a longer term plan would be, because as you again pointed out, Councillor Venner, there will be this process where there'll be a revisit, there'll be etc. etc. So I'm just interested to know where that sits within the time frame that's being given to you in that way.
Okay, Sal.
Shall I? Yeah. So if you look at the recommendations, then I think in terms of the quality and independence of audits, we've made the changes there now to ensure that there is explicit independence and moderation of those audits. We've put in place a way that we will pull together the themes and communicate that with all of our workforce. So we'll start to see the impact of that within a few weeks, because people will be undertaking that process in a different way. The quality and impact of management oversight, again, we've worked with the managers. There's a plan in place for what immediate actions we need to take in terms of the rationale for decision making being absolutely clear and explicit in all of the case files. So that work is already there. And I've just talked about what we've done around the strategy discussions. This issue around the quality and consistency of assessments and supervision, we've already met with some of our frontline staff to understand what some of the challenges are, and that will be something it's something that we work on all of the time, because it's it's a bit like the core bit of teaching and learning in schools. It's the thing that you have to keep concentrated on, keeping people trained and developed and supported on. And so what we have done with that is to increase the development opportunities around that, and making sure that we've put processes in place that ensure that everybody gets that training, development. They have ease of access to it. We're making just taking different approaches to some of that development, but we think that alongside the face-to-face teams coming together, the face-to-face management supervision, will improve the consistency of that practice. So we should see that happening again fairly soon. And we've put some actions in place that are, as I've described, immediate, but those issues about the continuing improvement of practice are much longer term ones, and we're already part of our service improvement plans, but we've bolstered them to make it more robust.
Okay, thank you for that, Sal. I've got Councillor Flynn next, please.
Thanks, Alan. Caroline, Sal, and to a certain extent yourself, actually pretty much answered the questions I was going to ask. And really, I wondered if we could have a regular update at each scrutiny board meeting in future about progress on the three areas that the Ofsted inspection identified, but more particularly because I was very concerned at the lack of attendance of the NHS and the police at the key strategy meetings. So if that could form part of the report back, I'd be grateful. Thanks.
I'm happy to do that. I just want to take, we take joint responsibility as a partnership for those strategy discussions. So it's all of our responsibility to ensure that all of our processes are really tight and that we are engaging with each other to make that process as straightforward as possible, because it has to happen within a very short space of time. And we had seen some improvements previously, but as I say, since the inspection, got full commitment from both sets of partners, absolutely no doubt on that. And since the inspection, in terms of that raw data, it is significantly improved. And I'm happy to come back and report to Scrutiny.
Okay, thank you for that. Kate is next, please.
Thanks. I was just going to say, just from the perspective of somebody who has worked in the past with directly with social workers in capacity of providing legal support, and actually going into social work offices and seeing how they actually operate on the ground. It is obviously a very collaborative profession, and particularly I think for newly qualified and recently qualified staff, it's so important, as Sal says, to have that contact with colleagues on the ground to learn, particularly in terms of understanding about how to analyse, how to provide the rationale. And it's obvious that the pandemic has hugely affected staff's ability to be able to do that, which would explain some of the issues around the consistency and reflection. It's really encouraging to sort of hear, the plan for improvement, and I see it as an opportunity. I don't see it as a negative at all. In the context of, really difficult circumstances that really dedicated staff have been working in. I think my only sort of question would be, obviously people are working, they're seeing each other, they're back working together again, more so at the moment, but I'm just conscious of the government's plan B in terms of infection rates and the potential for us to go back to a bit of a working from home scenario again. How does that actually affect social work practice on the ground and the ability to sort of address these areas for improvement? And also just in terms of sort of the training, really, I'd be interested to know a bit more about that in terms of to what extent do, again, sort of more newly qualified staff get the opportunity to really kind of sit down and look at individual case studies and have that sort of discussion around, how to analyse, how to rationalise, how to reach decisions and recommendations. But yeah, no, and sorry, the other thing I was going to say as well was just in terms of other agencies as well, all of the agencies are obviously under such significant pressure as a result of the pandemic. And I think it was difficult prior to the pandemic often to get representatives from other agencies to attend strategy discussions. I can tell you that from experience from going back a long time. And I'm conscious, of those increasing pressures going forward. And I think as well, it comes down to resources, it comes down to funding, and just really encouraging to hear Sal saying that, agencies are sort of, working together and there's really good dialogue happening. So I just sort of want to say, don't be disheartened. It sounds like you know what you need to do, and you're going in the right direction to address.
Okay, thank you for that, Kate. I'm going to take Councillor Brooks as the last contribution, and then we can sum up and sort of agree what our next steps are from there. So, Councillor Brooks, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just very briefly, because I know that time's pressing. So it's on page 60 of the report. It says with regards to the domestic abuse, because I think we all know that there's been a national rise in domestic violence over the pandemic. There's a recently introduced multi-agency meeting to strengthen their response to domestic abuse. And then it says, as this is a recent development, it was too soon to identify the impact of these arrangements. I just wondered if, like, internally, whether there's been any sort of positive outcomes from that approach, or whether it's still too soon to say. Like, it's not clear whether that's it's sort of too soon for the Ofsted report to say, or whether it's too soon for the council to say, if that makes sense.
Sal?
I think Julie wants to come in on the detail of that, so.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, just to say, it is a multi-agency arrangement, so it is something that we'll review. It's very, very early days, but we're almost reviewing it on a weekly basis, and then a more detailed multi-agency review on a monthly basis. So it's ourselves, it's Safe for Leeds, it's the police, you know, it's a whole multi-agency approach. We are hearing really positive feedback from the operational staff who are involved. There was something about the process helping us in particular look at re-referrals. So where we were having victims of domestic violence who were being re-referred, or incidents of domestic violence in relation to the same families. This was an area that we really, really wanted to focus on, you know, because the question is, what do we need to do differently in order to break this cycle and to address the issues? So we've got some really, really positive feedback. We're monitoring it, as I say, on a weekly and monthly basis. And there are some tweaks, you know, as you would expect, just in terms of, you know, more process, in terms of pathways, etc. But the early indications are that it is having a positive impact, and in particular on some of the areas where we did want that additional focus.
And just come in, Councillor Lamb, just a couple of points from Kate's contribution. So thanks, Kate, for that. That's really helpful. I think I do think that there's something for us if we end up in another situation. There's something for us about now kind of knowing a bit more about what people really might have needed in that pandemic, given I think it's the depth with which it has impacted. If you think about those, we think about those rates that I talked about, quarter of a mile from here, 1,600 per 100,000 rate, and you've got professionals that are needing to go in and visit in those circumstances, and where they come away to and where they have that face-to-face contact. I think that we would want to maybe look at what have we learned from that. If we're going to another lockdown, is there something else that we can do to really shore up and strengthen the face-to-face support, even in those quite challenging circumstances? So there is that. I think again, very insightful in terms of your points about newly qualified staff and the support that they need. I could still tell you about who the people were that influenced me in my first few months as a social worker back in 1994. So the interaction with your team and your team manager particularly, and your advanced practitioner in your team, those are the people that you learn the most from. And it's often a really big step between becoming qualified and doing those first few visits and working on your first few, working with your first few children and families. And so I think that we pay attention to that as people are coming back in and making sure that they've got all the support and leadership that they need in that space.
Thank you. Julie, did you want to come back in, or the new phrase I've heard is it a legacy hand?
Just back in quickly, Sal's made most of the points that I was going to make, but I think, I suppose in particular, just about our newly qualified staff, and that recognising that the experience that they've had over the last year, the last 18 months, has not been the norm. So we're doing an awful lot in terms of bolstering that, really, with some of the practice cafes that we've talked about. I think the final thing for me on this is that the fact that as people have come back in, to be quite honest, you don't really know what you've missed. until you're back in. So I think we're really gathering feedback from staff, from really qualified staff, from experienced social workers, from team managers, just about now that they're back in, actually they can almost sort of retrospectively think about what would have made that difference going forward. And in the event that we are in a plan B, we've certainly got a lot of feedback from staff that we can, we can use to plan ahead. Thank you, Councillor Lamb.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you very much to everyone who's contributed. And I think exactly the right tone has been struck. It's our job to be challenging, but the way we make the challenge is as important as making the challenge. So in terms of next steps, I think what I would propose is that we keep this as a standing item for as long as we feel is appropriate. So that might be for not too many cycles or a few. It doesn't have to be particularly in depth, and I don't want to put huge pressure on Sal and the team to bring us a massive report every time. It can just be theirs. It doesn't necessarily even need a report. It's just there's an item for information to give us an update, and then as things progress, we can sort of determine if any more action is needed or if we're comfortable that everything is on the right track. And so, does that sound reasonable, Sal? I don't want you to feel that we need a huge report every time for the agenda. It could just be a verbal update, I think.
I think that's really helpful, Councillor, as a way forward. Thanks.
Okay, is everybody happy with that, or are there any alternative suggestions? I'm seeing thumbs up and nods. So, okay, excellent. Right. Well, thank you, and thank you again, everybody, for striking the right tone in that. So, if we move on to item 6, which is the work schedule, I'll hand over to Angela to take us through it, and I believe Sal might want to chip in on this one as well. So, Angela.
Thank you, Chair. So this report relates to the board's forthcoming work schedule. However, the report does also reference the decision that was taken by the board to hold an additional meeting last week on the 8th of September, primarily to consider the proposal to expand St Edward's Catholic Primary School. And as the board is aware, a statement was subsequently produced, agreed by board members, which sets out the board's observations, conclusion and recommendations for the consideration of the executive board as part of its forthcoming meeting on the 22nd of September. So with regard to the board's forthcoming work schedule, the latest version is attached as Appendix 1 for members' consideration. I will now be updating this to reflect what's being discussed today by the board in relation to the board receiving regular updates to track the implementation and the impact of the improvement action plan that has been put in place following the Ofsted focused visit, the child poverty update report for March meeting now, also the proposal to arrange a working group meeting during October, primarily to look at implications of forthcoming guidelines for GCSE and A-level assessments for 2022, also looking at issues that have been raised around transitions. There's also the intention of the Directorate to bring a report to scrutiny around the revised 3A strategy. So what is actually proposed, Chair, is obviously myself and the Chair follow this up with Sal and his leadership team in terms of looking at appropriate timescales for these other pieces of work. For me then to communicate this to board members, including any potential impacts it may have in relation to other planned items on the work schedule, as I'm sure the board's keen to ensure that future meeting agendas do remain manageable. I'll pass back to you now, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Angela. I think the summary is that our to-do list just got a bit longer. And Sal, did you want to add anything?
I think given the time, Councillor Lamb, it would be appropriate for yourself, Angela, and myself to have that communication about how we might put it, and then send it out to people for any comments.
No problem. Okay, so with that, unless there are any questions on the work schedule, I'm not seeing any hands going up. So if I can just really thank everybody for their contributions this morning. We've covered an awful lot of ground in an incredible amount of depth and detail, and it's in contrast to yesterday. It really shows how well and effectively we can all work together when we're focused on exactly that. So it's kind of reassuring to come here after yesterday. So thank you all for that. And finally, I'd just like to really take the opportunity to thank Councillor Flint as it was technically his last board meeting last time out, and he's substituting for Councillor Stevenson, but it gives us an opportunity to really recognise the great contribution he's made to this board, which I certainly recognise. We've got an outstanding replacement in Councillor Richards, but we'll still miss you, Councillor Flynn, and thank you for all that you've brought to this agenda. It's much appreciated. So the final item with that is the date to the next meeting, which is scheduled to be the 13th of October at 10 o'clock. The pre-meeting will be at 9:45. All things going to plan, we should be back in Civic Hall in room 6 and 7, and I will be able to provide biscuits at that point, and it will feel hopefully a bit more like normal, and it would be really good to see all of you in person again. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye for now. Take care. Have a good day, everyone.
You too.